The Battle of Leipzig, fought in October 1813, marked a pivotal moment in European history, a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. The battle, often referred to as the Battle of the Nations, was a confrontation of immense scale, involving over 600,000 soldiers from multiple nations, making it one of the largest and most decisive engagements of the 19th century. It saw the combined forces of the Sixth Coalition, practically the rest of Europe, battle against Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire. The outcome would not only decide the fate of Napoleon's empire, but also reshape the future of Europe. As the autumn air grew colder in the city of Leipzig, an intense anticipation hung in the air. Napoleon, with his usual self-assurance, had mobilized his army to defend his hold over Central Europe, yet he faced a formidable coalition force composed of Austrian, Russian, Prussian, Swedish, and other allied troops. On the other side, the coalition leaders, determined to end Napoleon's dominance, had set their sights on crushing his forces and liberating Europe from his rule. The preparations for the battle were massive, involving weeks of maneuvering and strategic positioning by both sides. Napoleon, having fought in countless battles, was confident that his well-trained army, bolstered by his experience and his tactical genius, could overcome the sheer numbers of the coalition forces. However, the odds were stacked against him. The coalition army, though diverse in its composition, was highly motivated and unified in their determination to bring Napoleon's reign to an end. The battle commenced on the morning of October 16, 1813, as both sides faced off near the town of Leipzig. The battlefield stretched across a vast expanse of open terrain, punctuated by villages, forests, and rivers. The sky was overcast, casting a somber pall over the battlefield. Napoleon had positioned his forces in the center, with his elite Imperial Guard held in reserve, ready to exploit any weakness in the enemy's lines. His plan was to weaken the flanks of the coalition forces, drawing them in and then delivering a decisive blow with his central forces, particularly his cavalry. The coalition, on the other hand, had adopted a more defensive strategy, spreading out across the battlefield in an effort to encircle Napoleon's forces. The sheer number of troops they could bring to bear was staggering, about 350,000 soldiers, outnumbering Napoleon's army of around 200,000. Despite being outnumbered, Napoleon's forces were highly disciplined and experienced, their soldiers battle-hardened from years of war. As the battle began, the sounds of cannons roaring and muskets firing reverberated across the battlefield. The French forces, under Napoleon's command, advanced toward the center of the enemy lines, hoping to break through with a rapid, concentrated assault. The fighting was fierce, with artillery exchanges tearing through the ranks of both armies. Napoleon's cavalry, renowned for its speed and ferocity, struck the enemy's flanks, but the sheer size of the coalition's forces made it difficult to achieve any significant breakthrough. The battle raged on for hours, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. On the French side, the Imperial Guard stood poised to make a decisive strike, but Napoleon was cautious, waiting for the right moment to commit them fully. On the coalition side, the Prussians and Austrians fought desperately to hold their lines, knowing that the success of their coalition depended on holding their ground and preventing Napoleon from exploiting any gaps in their formations. As the day wore on, the fighting grew more intense, with each side pressing forward and retreating in a brutal cycle of attack and counterattack. The French forces, though highly skilled and experienced, began to show signs of wear, as the pressure from the overwhelming numbers of the coalition began to take its toll. The French artillery, once a formidable force on the battlefield, began to lose its effectiveness as the coalition forces adapted and closed in on their positions. Meanwhile, the coalition forces, fueled by a collective desire to end Napoleon's reign, fought with determination, pushing the French back and causing them to fall back toward the city of Leipzig itself. By the evening of October 16th, the French forces had been pushed back from their original positions, and the battle was far from over. Napoleon, still refusing to acknowledge the gravity of the situation, ordered a counterattack. His goal was to rally his forces and create an opportunity for a breakthrough. But as the night fell, the reality of the situation became clear. The coalition forces were closing in from all directions, and the French were being encircled. The next day, October 17th, saw continued fighting, with both sides exhausted from the previous day's brutal exchanges. Napoleon's army, though still formidable, was beginning to falter. The French artillery was now under constant pressure, and their cavalry, once feared throughout Europe, found itself outnumbered and overwhelmed by the coalition's forces. The coalition army, driven by the belief that victory was within their grasp, continued to press the French on all sides. As the battle dragged on, Napoleon found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His forces were outnumbered, exhausted, and surrounded on three sides. Despite his tactical brilliance, the sheer size and coordination of the coalition forces made it difficult for him to maneuver effectively. The Imperial Guard, which had been held in reserve, was now committed to the battle, but even their presence could not turn the tide. The French lines began to buckle, and Napoleon's options grew more limited with each passing hour. The situation worsened on October 18th, when Napoleon received word that his lines of retreat were being cut off. The coalition forces, now fully aware of the weakness in the French position, launched an all-out assault on Napoleon's forces. The French, who had once been so confident in their ability to defeat any enemy, found themselves fighting not just for victory, but for survival. The Imperial Guard, which had been a symbol of French invincibility, was thrown into the fray, but even their legendary reputation could not prevent the inevitable. By the afternoon of October 18th, the French were in full retreat. Napoleon, realizing that the battle was lost, ordered his forces to fall back toward Leipzig. The retreat was chaotic, with French soldiers attempting to flee from the encroaching coalition forces. The sound of cannon fire and muskets filled the air as the French attempted to disengage from the battle, but the sheer pressure from the coalition forces made it nearly impossible for them to escape unscathed. The final stages of the battle saw Napoleon's forces disintegrate under the weight of the coalition's advance. The French, who had once been the most feared military force in Europe, were now in full retreat, with their morale shattered and their forces in disarray. The coalition army, emboldened by their success, pressed forward relentlessly, capturing French soldiers and supplies as they advanced. As the battle came to an end on October 19th, the result was clear: Napoleon had been decisively defeated. His army, once the embodiment of French power and military superiority, had been broken by the combined forces of Europe. The Battle of Leipzig was a crushing blow to Napoleon's ambitions, signaling the beginning of the end for his empire. His forces, now in full retreat, would never recover from the devastating losses sustained in the battle. The aftermath of the battle was just as significant. Napoleon, now faced with the realization that his empire was crumbling, began planning for his retreat from Germany. The coalition, triumphant in their victory, would go on to press their advantage, eventually leading to the fall of Napoleon's empire. The Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations, had not only ended Napoleon's dominance in Europe but had set the stage for the eventual redrawing of the continent's political map. The defeat at Leipzig marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon, and Europe would never be the same again. The winds of October blew cold over the battlefield as the dawn of October 19, 1813, broke through the darkness. The early morning mist hung heavy, obscuring the devastation wrought by the previous days of relentless fighting. Yet, for the soldiers on both sides, there was little relief in the stillness that preceded the final push. The previous day had already confirmed the grim reality that Napoleon's grasp on Europe was slipping through his fingers. For the French, retreat had become their only option, and for the coalition forces, the moment of victory was almost within reach. The remnants of the French forces, now scattered and disorganized, were gathering themselves for one last stand. Napoleon, ever the strategist, had hoped to rally his troops and maintain some semblance of order amid the chaos. But the weight of the previous 2 days of fighting had taken its toll. His soldiers, once the pride of France, were exhausted and demoralized, many having witnessed the collapse of their lines and the overwhelming might of the coalition forces. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the field, the coalition leaders were preparing for the final assault. The Prussians, Austrians, Russians, and Swedes had fought side by side for the past few days, their shared goal now close to realization. The leaders of the coalition, Prince Schwarzenberg of Austria, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and King Frederick William III of Prussia, met in the rear of the battlefield, surveying the situation with a mix of cautious optimism and weary determination. They knew the battle was all but won, but the consequences of this victory could not yet be fully understood. The end of Napoleon's reign would forever alter the political landscape of Europe. As the morning sun began to rise, the sounds of the battlefield once again began to echo across the plains of Leipzig. The incessant roar of cannon fire, the sharp crack of musket shots, and the thunder of cavalry hoofs stirred the air once more. The coalition forces were now methodically tightening their noose around the French, pushing them back toward the city, where their options for retreat were rapidly diminishing. For Napoleon, it was becoming clear that he was fighting not for victory, but for survival. In the heart of the French position, Napoleon's headquarters were frantic. Couriers rushed in and out, bearing grim reports from every sector. The retreat was faltering. The roads leading to Leipzig were clogged with panicked soldiers, artillery wagons, and supplies, all of which were vulnerable to enemy fire. The coalition's forces, far from yielding, pressed forward with ruthless efficiency, determined to shatter any remnants of the French defense. Napoleon sat at a table in his headquarters, his face drawn and haggard. His once imposing figure seemed diminished by the weight of the situation. His generals, too, were visibly exhausted, their minds weary from days of constant combat. Despite this, Napoleon's resolve remained firm. He understood that if he could not turn the tide today, the battle would be lost, and with it, the empire he had fought so tirelessly to build. His mind raced, searching for an answer, an opening, something that could allow him to escape this trap. But the reality was undeniable. The French forces were outnumbered, surrounded, and exhausted. The Imperial Guard, the last reserve of his army, had fought valiantly but was now unable to hold back the advancing tide of the coalition's troops. The brilliant commander who had once outmaneuvered his enemies with masterful precision now found himself forced to contend with a sheer overwhelming force, one that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Napoleon's mind flicked through his options. A retreat was the only logical course of action, but it was no longer possible to withdraw in an organized manner. The roads were blocked. The enemy had effectively cut off all routes of escape. There was no way to salvage the situation. In his mind, the catastrophic nature of the defeat began to crystallize. This would not just be a military defeat. This would be a collapse of everything he had fought for, his empire, his vision for Europe, and his own legacy. Meanwhile, the coalition forces were preparing for their final push. With the French being pushed back toward Leipzig, the coalition commanders were fully aware that they were on the cusp of a historic victory. Their forces had encircled the city, and it was only a matter of time before the French were forced to surrender or be utterly destroyed. The Prussians, led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, and the Russians, under Tsar Alexander, were in the vanguard, closing in on the last of the French positions. The coalition forces had learned the harsh lessons of earlier battles with Napoleon's army. They knew that a direct assault could be devastating, and thus they applied pressure from all sides, wearing down the French positions gradually. The tactical aim was no longer to engage in another pitched battle but to box in the French and inflict devastating losses. The relentless artillery bombardments and small unit skirmishes only intensified the chaos as French soldiers, disoriented and exhausted, found themselves without leadership or direction. Napoleon had hoped for a glimmer of fortune, a stroke of luck that would allow him to fight his way out, but there was none to be found. The Imperial Guard, his last hope, fought bravely but could not stem the tide. The soldiers of the Guard, who had once been invincible, now faced the unbearable reality of their situation. It was no longer about honor, it was about survival. Their pride, once the foundation of their indomitable spirit, was being shattered as they were driven back, unable to hold their ground. By midday, the French position had become untenable. The coalition forces had decisively broken through the French lines, and the escape routes were no longer viable. The French soldiers were scattered, fleeing in disarray or surrendering as they realized the hopelessness of their position. The cries of the wounded, the sound of guns firing in the distance, and the screams of horses and men filled the air. It was the chaos of a broken army trying desperately to survive, to preserve what little remained of the once mighty French force. Napoleon, in his final moments on the battlefield, stood resolute, though it was clear that defeat was inevitable. He knew that this would be his greatest failure, the one that would be remembered throughout history. His vision of a united Europe, one that bore the mark of French dominance, had crumbled before his eyes. The same armies that had once conquered Europe now found themselves defeated, humiliated by the combined forces of the continent's monarchies. The rise of Napoleon, so swift and so powerful, was now met by an even swifter and more powerful downfall. As the day dragged on, the French forces continued to retreat toward Leipzig, many fleeing the battlefield entirely, some even abandoning their weapons and uniforms in their haste to escape. The Imperial Guard, once an elite force that had struck fear into the hearts of Europe's enemies, was now a mere shadow of its former self, its soldiers retreating in disarray. The final moments of the battle saw Napoleon give the order to withdraw from Leipzig. His army was in tatters, and there was no longer any hope of victory. The fight, once fierce and full of promise, had ended in total defeat. Napoleon's mind, which had once seen the world as his stage to command, now faced the grim truth that his empire was no more. The aftermath of the Battle of Leipzig was a tragedy for Napoleon and the French Empire. The victory for the coalition forces had been absolute. Not only had they defeated one of the greatest military commanders in history, but they had also struck a decisive blow against the empire that had dominated Europe for nearly 2 decades. For Napoleon, there was no escape from the consequences of his failure. His empire was collapsing, and with it, his dream of a French-dominated Europe. The Battle of Leipzig marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon Bonaparte. It was the moment when the tide of history turned against him, and it set the stage for his eventual exile to the island of Elba. Yet, even in defeat, Napoleon's legacy would endure. The events of Leipzig and the wars that followed would shape Europe's future for years to come, altering the course of history forever. The aftermath of the Battle of Leipzig left the battlefield strewn with the remnants of a shattered French army, and the remains of the bloody conflict that had transpired over 3 long days. It was a scene of devastation, a quiet horror settling over the land as the sounds of battle faded. The air, thick with the scent of gunpowder, smoke, and blood, was heavy with the weight of defeat. What had once been a mighty and feared force now lay broken, its soldiers scattered or captured, their morale utterly crushed. The coalition forces, weary yet victorious, began to consolidate their hold over the battlefield, preparing for the inevitable end of the war that had spanned across Europe for over a decade. Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor who had once seemed invincible, now faced the reality of his failure. The retreat had been chaotic, and now, in the silence following the battle, he was left to contemplate the enormity of his defeat. The French were in full retreat, with their backs to the city of Leipzig itself, cut off from their supply lines and surrounded by a swelling tide of enemy forces. Napoleon, resolute and unwilling to acknowledge the full extent of his failure, had ordered a last-ditch effort to hold the city. Yet, even he could no longer deny that his dream of a European empire had collapsed in the wake of the overwhelming strength of the coalition. As the French army continued its disorganized retreat, scattered groups of soldiers stumbled across the battlefield, many of them wounded, many of them lost in the fog of war. The remnants of Napoleon's Imperial Guard, once the pride of his military forces, now fought only to survive, their famous discipline and might lost in the frantic panic of retreat. The heroic soldiers who had once stood unshakable on battlefields across Europe now seemed broken, their resolve faltering as the reality of their situation became clear. What had been a symbol of French power was now a fragmented shadow, moving aimlessly across the landscape as a defeated force. At Napoleon's headquarters, there was a sense of foreboding. The once imposing command tent, where plans had been drawn and victories had been celebrated, now stood empty, save for the scattered maps and abandoned orders. Napoleon sat at a small table, his hands pressed against his face, weary beyond measure. His body, once tall and imposing, now seemed smaller, hunched under the weight of defeat. His face, pale and drawn, reflected the toll that the battle had taken, both physically and emotionally. His mind, once a battlefield of strategy and brilliance, now raced through every miscalculation, every flaw, every missed opportunity that had led him to this point. The reality was inescapable. The French Empire was crumbling. Napoleon's generals and aides, those who had remained loyal throughout the long campaign, gathered around him, awaiting orders that were no longer forthcoming. They had seen their emperor at his peak, when his victories were celebrated across Europe, and now they saw him in his lowest moment. Even they, who had followed him into every battle, could sense the finality of this defeat. As they looked at him, there was a sense of quiet despair. The air was thick with unspoken words, and no one dared break the silence. Among them, there were murmurs of what might happen next. Some of Napoleon's officers still clung to hope, urging the emperor to rally his forces, to make one final stand. But even they knew the reality of their situation. The French were outnumbered and surrounded, with no way to break through the coalition's encirclement. The soldiers of the coalition, though exhausted from the fighting, had the momentum now, and the French army, decimated and demoralized, had nothing left to give. Napoleon, the great conqueror, had been outmaneuvered, and the empire he had built was collapsing under the pressure of its own overextension. Outside the headquarters, the coalition forces advanced steadily, pushing the remnants of the French army further into the city. The Prussians, Russians, Austrians, and Swedes, though exhausted from their own brutal struggle, could sense that the end was near. The sound of drums and the distant calls of orders reverberated through the streets of Leipzig, as the victorious forces prepared for the final phase of the battle, the siege of the city. The French soldiers, those who were not captured, began to filter through the city, moving towards makeshift defensive positions and preparing for the inevitable assault. The streets of Leipzig, which had once echoed with the sound of marching soldiers, now carried the weight of retreating troops, their faces grim and weary. The shops and homes were abandoned, the quiet streets filled only with the sounds of distant cannon fire and the occasional burst of musket shots as skirmishes broke out between the retreating French and the advancing coalition forces. The citizens of the city, once neutral in this great struggle, now found themselves caught in the midst of the chaos. Many sought shelter as the sounds of battle grew ever closer. For them, the war was no longer a distant concern. It had come to their doorstep, and the future of their city was now in the hands of the victors. Napoleon knew that the walls of Leipzig would not hold. The coalition forces had surrounded the city, and there was no way for him to escape. His generals urged him to abandon the city and seek refuge in France, but even that route was now uncertain. The road to France was blocked by the advancing armies of the coalition, and the French forces were too scattered to mount any organized defense. His options had narrowed, and there was little hope left. It was clear that his empire, which had once stretched from Spain to Russia, was now reduced to a fraction of its former power. As the final assault began, Napoleon's thoughts turned to the consequences of his defeat. The battle had not just been a loss on the battlefield, it was the loss of everything he had fought for. His dreams of a Europe united under French hegemony were shattered. His vision of a continent ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had reshaped Europe through war and diplomacy, was now crumbling. The immense personal cost of his ambition, the toll it had taken on his soldiers and his people, was becoming all too clear. In the chaos of the final retreat, Napoleon realized that he could no longer lead the army he had built. His strength was gone, his empire in ruins, and his enemies closing in. The Battle of Leipzig had not just been a military defeat, it was a personal collapse, a fall from greatness that would be remembered for generations to come. Napoleon's name, once synonymous with triumph and glory, would now be spoken of with sorrow and regret. His empire would not survive the battle, and neither would the man who had dreamed of ruling Europe. As the final hours of the battle unfolded, Napoleon was forced to face the inevitability of his downfall. The coalition forces breached the gates of Leipzig, their troops pouring into the city in a final, decisive push. The once proud French army was now broken and scattered. For Napoleon, there would be no victory this time, only the bitter reality of defeat. The last of his hopes lay in his escape from Leipzig, but even that was becoming impossible. The final scene of the Battle of Leipzig was one of surrender, of broken dreams and crushed ambitions. Napoleon, who had once been the master of Europe, now found himself at the mercy of his enemies. The coalition forces, victorious and resolute, would soon march into the heart of France, and the man who had once ruled with such power would be left to face the consequences of his grand ambition. The Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, would mark the end of an era, and Europe would never be the same again. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, casting a darkened gloom over the city of Leipzig. The devastation of the battle had left its marks everywhere: the charred remains of artillery positions, the wreckage of broken wagons and abandoned cannons, and the stench of death that hung heavy in the air. The city was eerily quiet now, save for the occasional clatter of military boots or the distant call of a commander giving orders. The battle was over, but the consequences would stretch far beyond the fields and streets of Leipzig. For Napoleon, the aftermath of defeat felt suffocating. He had retreated into the shadows of the city, his thoughts clouded with the enormity of what had transpired. His soldiers were scattered and broken, many of them prisoners now, waiting to be taken by the victorious coalition forces. The remnants of his once mighty army had been decimated, their hopes of salvation dashed as they found themselves cornered within the city. The French emperor had always been a master of grand strategy, but there was no escaping the reality of this loss. His empire, built through years of bloodshed, ambition, and brilliance, was crumbling before him. Napoleon sat in a dimly lit room, surrounded by his closest advisers and generals, who had remained by his side in these darkest of hours. His face, once so confident and imposing, now looked hollow and worn, aged by the weight of his failure. His mind, once sharp and calculating, now seemed overwhelmed by the gravity of his situation. The weight of the losses, the lives lost on both sides, the destruction of his army, the collapse of his empire, pressed down upon him like an unrelenting force. Around him, the atmosphere was tense, thick with unease and apprehension. The generals, once loyal soldiers who had followed Napoleon into battle after battle, exchanged nervous glances. They had served him faithfully, risking everything in his name, but now they found themselves trapped in a no-win situation. No longer were they the proud commanders of a victorious army. They were survivors of a defeated force, trying to salvage what remained of their dignity. Their eyes flickered to Napoleon, waiting for guidance, but there was nothing but silence. The emperor, ever the master of words and grand speeches, could offer no rallying cry, no glimmer of hope to those who had stood by him. The room was heavy with the realization that the once great French Empire had been reduced to rubble. There would be no more campaigns to win, no more glory to be claimed. Napoleon's empire was on the verge of disintegration, and with it, his dreams for Europe. The news of the battle's conclusion had already spread throughout Leipzig. The defeated soldiers, some of whom were no longer wearing their uniforms, moved through the streets, their faces a mixture of fear, shame, and hopelessness. The cries of the wounded echoed from every corner, and the once proud French banners, symbols of imperial might, now hung limp and tattered, a stark reminder of the empire's collapse. Napoleon's thoughts turned to his family. His wife, Marie-Louise, who had once stood by his side as empress, would undoubtedly be watching the events unfold with a mixture of concern and dread. He thought of his young son, the King of Rome, who had been born into a dynasty that was now on the brink of extinction. His dreams of a lasting Napoleonic dynasty seemed more distant than ever. He had been a man who once believed in the inevitability of his own greatness, but now, for the first time, he faced the crushing realization that his reign had come to an end. The room remained silent, the weight of this knowledge settling over the gathered officers. The once mighty French army, once the terror of Europe, now stood on the brink of extinction. The emperor, surrounded by the leaders who had helped him shape his destiny, could only listen as his closest generals discussed what little remained. They spoke in hushed tones, discussing surrender terms, possible retreats, and the future of the French army. But no matter how many plans were discussed, none could change the fact that the war was lost. The empire was collapsing, and no number of victories would reverse the momentum that the coalition forces had now built. Word soon arrived that the coalition forces were closing in on Napoleon's location. The army, now fully encircled, had nowhere to go. The remnants of the French army had been driven into a corner, and their only option now was to surrender or face utter annihilation. Napoleon's thoughts raced as he considered the fate of his soldiers, of his empire, and of himself. To surrender was to acknowledge the end of everything he had fought for. To die in battle, to go down in flames, would be a fitting end for a man who had risen from humble beginnings to become the Emperor of Europe. But the weight of his decisions, of his empire's downfall, bore heavily upon him. The man who had once controlled the fate of nations now found himself helpless, a prisoner of his own ambition. As night fell, the scene in the city grew more chaotic. The sounds of marching feet, the clatter of hooves, and the occasional shout echoed through the streets. The coalition forces, organized and methodical, advanced with the determination of men who knew victory was within their grasp. They had fought long and hard to reach this point, and now, with the French army in disarray, they could almost taste the sweetness of their triumph. Their path was clear. They would claim Leipzig, capture the remnants of Napoleon's army, and bring the final curtain down on his reign. In the heart of the city, the French soldiers huddled together, fearful and disillusioned. Their comrades had fallen, their leaders were scattered or imprisoned, and there was no longer any semblance of order. Some whispered of escape, of breaking through the encirclement in a last desperate bid for freedom. Others, too tired to fight any longer, simply waited to be taken. The sense of hopelessness was pervasive. The once proud Imperial Guard, the men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Napoleon through countless victories, now found themselves trapped within the city walls. The loyalty they had felt for their emperor was still there, but it was buried beneath a mountain of fear and despair. They had been betrayed by fate, and now they awaited the inevitable. As the coalition forces closed in, Napoleon's fate was sealed. The emperor, once the ruler of Europe, was now a figure caught in the web of history, the victim of his own ambition. His soldiers, once a proud and powerful force, had been scattered, and the empire he had built from the ground up was no more. The fate of the French monarchy, and of Europe itself, now lay in the hands of the victorious powers who had fought so hard to end his reign. As dawn approached, the first light of morning illuminated the streets of Leipzig, casting long shadows over the broken city. Napoleon, ever the strategist, was still mulling over his next move, but there was little left to consider. The final act of his reign was coming to an end, and the world would soon witness the fall of one of history's greatest military commanders. The Battle of Leipzig had been a turning point, a moment that would be remembered for centuries. It was the death knell for the Napoleonic Empire, and the world that had once bent to Napoleon's will was now free to rebuild. And so, as the final hours of the night ticked away, the fate of the emperor, the soldiers, and the empire he had built hung in the balance. The Battle of Leipzig was over, but its consequences would echo through the annals of history, a testament to the fragility of power and the inevitable rise and fall of empires. The world was changing, and Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer its master. The morning light of October 19, 1813, broke over Leipzig with a cold, muted clarity, casting its pale rays across the smoldering remnants of the battlefield. The once vibrant city now stood in eerie silence, as though the chaos of the past days had drained all life from it. Smoke still rose from the wreckage, and the sounds of distant movement, now steady and systematic, signified the transition from war to occupation. The battle had ended, but the reverberations of its outcome were still being felt, heavy and undeniable. Napoleon's personal struggle had reached its apex. His brilliant mind, once focused on sweeping conquests and complex strategies, was now fractured, caught between the bitter reality of his defeat and the lingering hope that somehow he could still reclaim his empire. The emperor, who had once dominated battlefields from the Danube to Moscow, now found himself cornered, trapped within the walls of a city that had witnessed both his rise and now his impending fall. Napoleon sat alone in a small room, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. The reports from his generals had confirmed what he had long feared. His army, shattered and disbanded, was no longer capable of holding Leipzig or defending any other French position in the region. He had fought tirelessly, determined to resist, but the overwhelming power of the coalition forces, their sheer numbers, and the relentless tactics of the Prussians, Russians, Austrians, and Swedes had worn him down. His once invincible army, the pride of his empire, had been decimated, and now he found himself, for the first time in many years, at a loss for what to do next. Outside, the coalition forces were advancing into the city in an orderly march. The streets were filled with the sound of disciplined footsteps and the distant cries of orders being barked in German, Russian, and Swedish. The French forces had little left in the way of organization or morale. Some soldiers had surrendered, while others simply wandered aimlessly through the city, their faces gaunt, their spirits crushed. They had been abandoned, not just by their emperor, but by the very idea of victory itself. It was a scene of despair, where the hopes of soldiers and commanders alike had been dashed, replaced by the unrelenting certainty that the war was over, and that their side had lost. Napoleon stood from his seat, walking slowly to the window, his hand resting on the frame as he gazed out over the city. The image before him was surreal, a city once filled with the energy and anticipation of war, now hollowed out by it. The streets were littered with abandoned weapons, the remnants of broken artillery, and the occasional wounded soldier limping through the wreckage. Yet it was the silence of the city that struck him the hardest. There were no more trumpet calls, no more distant drumbeats of the army's march. What had once been a living, breathing entity of power and ambition was now eerily still. His mind turned to his generals, many of whom had already sought refuge, disappearing into the shadows to avoid capture. Some were in hiding, hoping to escape the coalition's grasp, while others, like Marshal Ney, who had fought with unparalleled valor on the front lines, had simply surrendered in the hopes of negotiating better terms for themselves and their men. The betrayal was bitter, but Napoleon could not afford to dwell on it now. His thoughts focused instead on the grim task at hand, the survival of himself, and what remained of his loyal officers. The finality of his situation had slowly begun to settle in. The dream of a French empire, one that stretched across Europe, from Spain to the Russian heartlands, was gone. In its place, there was nothing but ruin. The vast network of alliances and vassal states he had built over the years had crumbled. The German states, once firmly under his influence, had now turned against him. The rest of Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Baltic, had risen in resistance against his rule. Even in France, whispers of discontent were growing. The citizens and the soldiers, weary from years of continuous war, no longer had the stomach to support his ambitions. His thoughts wandered briefly to his family. His son, the King of Rome, was still a child, far too young to understand the consequences of his father's failure. Napoleon had always believed that his son would one day inherit his empire, that the Bonaparte legacy would continue into the future. But that dream, too, was now slipping away from him. His wife, Marie-Louise, would be watching from afar, no doubt wondering whether she, too, would be caught up in the fallout from his downfall. What would become of her, and of his son? What would be the fate of the French throne? In his heart, Napoleon felt the aching weight of a man who had not just lost a war but also lost his family's future. A knock at the door brought him back to the present. One of his aides, a young officer who had served him since the early days of his reign, entered with a look of urgency on his face. His hands trembled slightly as he approached the emperor, knowing that the fate of the nation, and of Napoleon himself, was now in his hands. Napoleon turned slowly, his piercing eyes locking onto the officer's face. "Your Majesty," the aide began, his voice strained but respectful. "The coalition forces are nearly upon us. The city has fallen. The time has come for you to decide what happens next. The options are limited, but the most prudent course would be surrender." Napoleon's face remained unreadable, though the weight of the moment was not lost on him. He had fought for years, through countless battles and political intrigues, to shape his destiny and that of Europe. Now, it seemed, that destiny was slipping beyond his reach. He took a moment to reflect on the officer's words, as though measuring them against the cost of all his decisions, the battles, the alliances, the sacrifices. And in that moment, the full extent of his failure was undeniable. His empire, his dream, was no more. "I will not surrender," Napoleon finally said, his voice tinged with both bitterness and resolve. He turned away from the officer, staring out at the city once more. But we will leave! The army must retreat. We will make for France. The aide hesitated, sensing the Emperor's exhaustion, the deep weariness that pervaded his every word and movement. It was not the usual defiant Napoleon that spoke. This was a man broken by the weight of his failures. Yet there was still a spark of his former resolve in his words, an ember that refused to die. I understand, sire, the officer replied, bowing slightly. We will make preparations immediately. But, Your Majesty, you must understand that our options are few. The coalition forces are closing in. Napoleon nodded, his back still to the aide, his thoughts distant. I know. We have no choice but to try. The officer left, and for a long moment, Napoleon stood alone, his mind swirling with the grim realities of the moment. What lay ahead? The journey to France would be fraught with danger, and his army was in no condition to make such a trek. But what other option remained? The shadow of his once great empire loomed over him like a suffocating cloud. The world had changed, and in his heart, Napoleon knew that his time was over. The city was falling, and with it, so too was the man who had once seemed invincible. But as he turned away from the window, the faintest trace of a plan began to form in his mind. Escape, survival, and perhaps, in time, a way to rebuild. There was still a part of Napoleon that refused to concede total defeat. It was the final ember of ambition within him, flickering faintly in the cold winds of history. The Battle of Leipzig had ended, but the war for Napoleon's soul was far from over. And as he prepared to leave the city that had witnessed both his triumphs and his downfall, he knew that the future, though uncertain, still held the possibility of one final chapter in his extraordinary life. The streets of Leipzig were now fully under the control of the coalition forces, their flags flying proudly above the shattered city. The once heroic march of the French army, resplendent in their uniforms and marching with purpose, had been replaced by the grim reality of defeat. The soldiers, disheveled and broken, were now little more than prisoners of war, scattered throughout the city, their futures uncertain. In every corner, the remnants of Napoleon's grand ambition lay scattered like debris after a great storm, an empire shattered, a dream extinguished. Napoleon stood on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a few loyal officers and the broken remnants of his personal guard. His heart, once filled with the fire of ambition and conquest, now felt heavy, weighed down by the realization of his failure. He had led nations to war, dictated the fate of millions, and built an empire that stretched across Europe. But now, in the midst of the ruins, he was nothing more than a man caught in the tide of history, his once great power slipping through his fingers. As they moved through the streets, the French soldiers seemed like ghosts of their former selves, exhausted, demoralized, and haunted by the images of the past few days. The sounds of their steps were muffled by the weight of their defeat, the once proud Imperial Guard now nothing more than a shadow of its former glory. Their uniforms were torn and blood-stained, their faces drawn with fatigue. Some marched with their heads down, while others exchanged tired glances with their comrades, as if searching for some sign of hope that had long since disappeared. The weight of their loss was palpable, a collective realization that the battle had been lost and the empire was crumbling. The dream of a unified Europe under Napoleon's banner was now a distant memory, and with it, the soldiers who had fought so hard for it. For many, there was no longer any hope of glory, no more triumphs to look forward to. The reality of war, with all its brutality and sacrifice, had left them with nothing but the bitter taste of failure. Napoleon, despite the weight of the situation, still carried himself with an air of defiance. His posture was upright, his eyes sharp, though there was a weariness in them that had not been there before. The sight of his army in ruins was a hard blow to him, but it was not one that would break him entirely. He had survived worse, had faced challenges that seemed insurmountable in the past. And yet, the finality of this defeat felt different. It was not just a battle lost, it was an empire collapsing, the end of an era. As he walked through the city, a few of the French soldiers, still loyal to their emperor despite the overwhelming odds, attempted to rally around him. They had followed him through countless campaigns, from the sands of Egypt to the snow-covered Russian fields. Now, however, they seemed like men lost at sea, grasping for any sign of direction or purpose in the wake of their utter collapse. "Emperor," one of the soldiers said quietly, his voice full of the kind of reverence that had once been universal. "What will become of us? What do we do now?" Napoleon looked at the soldier, the words heavy on his tongue. He had led them to greatness, and now he was powerless to protect them from the consequences of this catastrophic loss. What could he say? What hope could he offer? The empire was gone, his army in tatters, and the once proud banner of France was now no more than a symbol of failure. "Do not despair," Napoleon said, his voice firm though his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. "We shall rebuild. We always rebuild. This is not the end." But even as he spoke, Napoleon knew the truth. There was no more rebuilding this time. The empire, once stretching across Europe with an iron grip, had fractured. His allies had turned against him, his enemies had united with renewed vigor, and the French people, weary and disillusioned after years of war, were no longer willing to follow him into the abyss. As they continued through the streets, they passed scenes of surrender and despair. Groups of French soldiers, their faces hollow with exhaustion, gathered together in small clusters, discussing their fate in hushed tones. Some had already begun the long march toward captivity, bound for the prison camps that awaited them. Others, too shattered by the carnage of the battle, had simply given up. Some were even stripping off their uniforms, casting them aside as a symbol of their own personal abandonment of the empire they had once fought for with pride. The coalition forces, now the victors, patrolled the streets in tight formations, their eyes cold and watchful. The Russian, Prussian, and Austrian soldiers moved through the city with a sense of purpose, their expressions marked by the satisfaction of a long-awaited triumph. They had fought hard to reach this moment, and now that it was theirs, they made sure to keep the French soldiers in check. Every now and then, a French soldier would meet the gaze of one of his captors, their eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. The once unshakable confidence that had been a hallmark of the French army seemed utterly gone, replaced by the hollow realization that their cause was lost. Napoleon and his small entourage moved silently, their presence barely acknowledged by the surrounding soldiers. His mind, once razor-sharp and full of strategic brilliance, was now clouded with doubts. He had always been a master of war, capable of seeing possibilities others couldn't, but now, as he walked through the ruins of his empire, he could no longer see the way forward. His mind, too, seemed to have betrayed him. The weight of his failure felt suffocating. They reached the outskirts of the city, where a small, hastily gathered group of his remaining officers waited, their faces somber. Marshal Ney, who had fought with unparalleled courage and skill during the battle, stood at the forefront, his uniform still stained with the blood of battle. Despite the defeat, there was still an air of respect that clung to him, as though he was one of the last remaining symbols of Napoleon's former greatness. But even Ney's steely gaze betrayed a hint of exhaustion, a weariness that had come from witnessing the collapse of the empire he had fought so fiercely to preserve. "Marshal," Napoleon said softly, addressing Ney as he approached. "We have no choice now but to retreat. We must head back to France." Ney nodded, but his face was grim. "Sire, the army is in disarray. We've lost too many men. There is nothing left here. We must make for safety, if there is such a thing left for us." Napoleon stood still for a moment, taking in the sight of his battered soldiers, his loyal officers, and the city of Leipzig in the distance, its outlines now fading in the haze of the morning. The finality of his situation was clear to him now. This was not just a tactical withdrawal, a retreat to fight another day. No, this was the beginning of a different journey, a journey toward exile, toward the eventual death of his grand vision. But there was still a flicker of the man he once was, the ambition that had driven him to reshape the world. He had been brought low, but he was not yet finished. Not completely, anyway. "We will survive this," Napoleon said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We will rebuild, and we will rise again." But the reality weighed heavy on him. The empire was shattered, the soldiers broken. The Emperor had fought his last battle in Leipzig, and now, with a final glance over the devastated city, he turned and began to walk away, knowing that what lay ahead would not be glory, but the uncertain shadows of exile and defeat. The Battle of Leipzig had not just ended an era for Napoleon, it had ended an entire way of thinking. The world that he had sought to control and dominate was now beyond his grasp. The future, whatever it might hold, was no longer his to shape. It had slipped away into the hands of others, and he was now left with the painful reality of his fall from power. The long road to the French frontier stretched ahead, a desolate path that seemed to wind endlessly toward an uncertain future. Napoleon's entourage moved in a quiet, solemn procession, the once grand imperial guard now reduced to a mere handful of men, their proud faces lined with fatigue, their steps slow and heavy. The air was damp, cold, and filled with the bitter scent of defeat. The grand vision of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once shaped Europe to his will, seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars themselves. Napoleon himself rode at the head of the group, his posture stiff, his face taut with concentration, though his eyes held none of the fire they once had. He gazed out over the barren landscape, the distant hills and trees appearing blurred in the haze of his exhaustion. His mind was restless, consumed by a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. It had been a week since the Battle of Leipzig, and with each passing hour, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him more and more. What had once seemed unthinkable, the collapse of his empire, was now an undeniable reality, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawed at his soul. His loyal officers, too, had fallen into a quiet resignation. Each of them carried the burden of the loss differently. Some spoke little, lost in their own thoughts, while others stole glances at Napoleon, searching for a flicker of his old defiance, his old brilliance. But it was gone now. The man who had once inspired legions of soldiers, who had commanded the loyalty of entire nations, now seemed more like a shadow of himself. His decisions, once swift and unyielding, were now tempered by doubt, his once indomitable will eroded by the crushing reality of failure. Napoleon's thoughts drifted back to Leipzig. The brutal clash of arms, the thunder of cannon fire, the cries of men on both sides, it all seemed so distant now, like a dream he had been trapped within, a dream that had finally shattered. How had it come to this? How had he, the master of Europe, the Emperor of the French, lost everything in the span of a few short days? The coalition forces, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Sweden, had surrounded him, overwhelmed him, and broken his army. Even as he had tried to hold the lines, his generals had faltered, the resistance had crumbled, and the battle had slipped beyond his grasp. His thoughts darkened as he recalled the final moments of the battle, the overwhelming tide of enemy troops pouring through the broken French lines, the sense of helplessness that had washed over him as his once mighty forces scattered in defeat. He had fought for every inch, refusing to give up until the last possible moment, but in the end, even his legendary determination had been no match for the sheer numbers and coordination of the coalition armies. For the first time, Napoleon had truly felt his mortality. The empire he had built, brick by brick, with blood and sweat, was gone. The retreat was grueling. Every day was a struggle, with the French army growing smaller and weaker with each passing hour. Napoleon's soldiers, who had once marched with the pride of invincibility, now trudged wearily, their heads bowed, their spirits broken. Supplies were scarce, the cold was biting, and the food rations were dwindling. Many soldiers had fallen behind, too weak to continue, while others had simply disappeared into the wilderness, lost to the madness of war and the hopelessness of their situation. Napoleon's once loyal aides, who had followed him through so many battles, were now shadows of their former selves. The camaraderie that had once defined the Imperial Guard had all but disappeared. What remained was a sense of isolation, a quiet realization that the end of this war, and the end of Napoleon's reign, was inevitable. Napoleon's horse, the steed he had ridden for so many years, trotted along the road with a mechanical rhythm, its hooves clattering against the stone ground, echoing in the silence of the landscape. The steady sound was almost calming to Napoleon, a faint reminder of the order he had once commanded. But even the familiar comfort of his horse could not erase the turmoil in his mind. His thoughts turned to Paris, to the France he had built, to the people who had once adored him. Could he ever return to that place again, to the capital that had been the heart of his empire? The thought of Paris brought with it a wave of bitterness. He had led France to glory, but now that very nation, the people who had once embraced him as their emperor, would soon turn their backs on him. The whispers of discontent had already begun in the streets of Paris, even as he had continued to rally his forces in the wake of the failed Russian campaign. The weariness of war had taken its toll on the people of France, and they would no longer tolerate the endless conflict that had ravaged their land. There was no more glory to be had, no more victories to be won. In the weeks following Leipzig, the path to Paris was not just a physical journey, it was an emotional one. The Napoleon that had once arrived in Paris as a young general, determined to reshape the world, was now a broken man, exiled by history, betrayed by his own forces, and abandoned by the very idea of his empire. His thoughts now turned inward as he began to contemplate his future, or what little of it remained. What would become of him? The alliance of Europe had made it clear that there would be no mercy. He was not just a defeated general, he was the symbol of everything they had fought against. His future, if he survived at all, would be a solitary one. He had already heard the rumors of exile, perhaps to the island of Elba, perhaps further still. No matter where he went, he would be a prisoner of his own making, a man whose name would no longer strike fear into the hearts of his enemies, but whose legend would slowly fade into obscurity. At the head of the retreating column, Napoleon was joined by his closest confidants. Marshal Ney, who had fought with unflinching courage in the battle, now appeared as though the weight of the defeat had crushed him as well. Ney had long been one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders, a loyal warrior who had stood beside him through thick and thin. Yet even Ney could not escape the toll of the past days. His face was haggard, his eyes distant, as though he too had come to terms with the finality of the defeat. "Your Majesty," Ney said quietly, his voice hoarse from days of travel and battle. "The road ahead is uncertain, but we must keep moving. We must reach the safety of France, wherever it may be." Napoleon nodded, his gaze fixed firmly on the horizon, though his thoughts were far from the road ahead. "Yes, we move forward, Marshal. But what is there for us now? What is left after all this?" His voice cracked ever so slightly, a rare vulnerability creeping through his usual composure. "There is always something," Ney replied, his voice firm with the conviction of a soldier who had known both triumph and loss. "We will survive, sire. You have survived worse." Napoleon did not respond. His eyes, clouded with 1,000 thoughts, gazed out over the barren fields as they continued their journey. The cold wind cut through his coat, but he barely noticed. All he could feel now was the weight of his loss, the loss of an empire, the loss of his own invincibility, and the loss of everything he had fought so fiercely to build. As the group moved deeper into the heart of France, the first hints of the coming winter began to settle over the land. The fields, once green and lush, were now brown and bleak. The forests whispered of the approaching frost, and the sky above hung heavy with clouds. There was no sun, only an endless gray sky that seemed to mirror Napoleon's state of mind. The retreat to France, to whatever would await him there, was now an inevitable march toward the next chapter of his life, exile. It would be a quiet, solitary existence, far removed from the courts of Europe and the grand palaces that had once been the stage for his greatest triumphs. But for now, all Napoleon could do was ride forward, one foot in front of the other, as the shadow of his once glorious empire receded into the past. The sky over the Mediterranean was heavy with the distant promise of rain. Napoleon, now a man cast adrift on the tides of history, stood on the cliffs of Elba, the island that was now his prison. The once great emperor who had commanded armies, reshaped nations, and ruled an empire spanning Europe, now gazed out at the calm, blue sea with a quiet sense of resignation. It had been months since his arrival at Elba, and the weight of exile had slowly settled into his bones, as though it had become an irreversible part of him. The island was small, rugged, and remote, barely a speck on the map of Europe, barely a shadow of the once mighty France. The seas, which had once symbolized his ambition and power, now seemed like an indifferent force, stretching endlessly into the horizon, mocking him with their vast, unchanging expanse. Behind him, the fortifications of the small island sat like a monument to his downfall. Once, Napoleon had been the master of the most powerful army in the world, his name a legend whispered across battlefields and courts alike. Now, he was a solitary figure, surrounded by a handful of loyalists, his every move watched closely by the men sent to ensure he did not escape. His dreams of grandeur, of rebuilding his empire, now seemed like distant echoes in the night, faint, fragile, and fading. The soldiers who had accompanied him to Elba had long since settled into their new life on the island. Some had taken up work as the island's small army, others had resigned themselves to simple labor. They lived in a strange, disjointed routine. For them, the days passed without event. They had witnessed their emperor's fall and had followed him here, but their loyalty was no longer accompanied by the fervor it once had. The glory days of Napoleon seemed to be part of a different era, a world that no longer existed. Napoleon, however, could not accept this life. His mind, still sharp and focused, refused to settle into the quiet rhythm of island life. His eyes burned with a fire that could not be extinguished, a fire that still longed for more than the confinement of this place. He had been defeated, yes, but that did not mean his ambition was gone. His thoughts constantly swirled with plans for escape, for returning to France, for reclaiming what he had lost. He could not bear the thought of dying here, in this barren corner of the world, far from the splendor and power he had once commanded. His empire had been shattered, but in his heart he still believed it could be restored. "General Bertrand," Napoleon called, his voice firm, though there was a thin layer of weariness in it. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a tattered uniform approached. General Bertrand, a loyal officer who had followed Napoleon through countless battles, now stood before his emperor, awaiting orders. His face was marked by the same fatigue that Napoleon had seen in so many others. The long months on Elba had taken their toll on him as well. But his eyes still held a glimmer of devotion, a reminder of the man who had once been part of the Grand Empire. "Sire," General Bertrand replied with a bow, his tone respectful, but tinged with the same resignation that colored their shared exile. Napoleon turned away from the sea and looked directly at Bertrand. "Do you ever think about France, General? About what we have lost?" "I do, sire," Bertrand said, his voice quieter now. "We all do. But what is there left to do? You gave everything to France. You created an empire, but now it is gone. There is no path forward here." Napoleon's lips twisted in frustration. His hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white. "There is always a path forward," he insisted, his voice sharp with a conviction that still burned in him. "There is always a way back." Bertrand remained silent, but the expression on his face spoke volumes. The general had served under Napoleon for years, and he knew the man better than anyone. He had witnessed his rise to power and his fall from grace, and now, on this small island in the Mediterranean, he could see the toll exile had taken on his once mighty emperor. But Bertrand also knew that Napoleon would never accept this life, this quiet death on an island. He would never give in to the reality of his situation. The fire that had made him the Emperor of Europe could not be so easily extinguished. The air on Elba was still, the silence between them stretching out like the unbroken horizon. Napoleon's thoughts churned, and in that moment, he could almost see the future unfolding before him, a future in which he could escape the island, return to France, and reclaim his throne. He had done it before. He had risen from nothing to become the master of Europe. Surely he could do it again. He walked to the edge of the cliff, his boots kicking up small stones as he did so. The sea crashed against the rocks far below, its rhythmic sound filling the air. Napoleon's eyes narrowed as he looked out at the water, his mind working furiously. The idea had been forming in his mind for weeks, and now it seemed like a plan that could work. He would escape Elba, sail to the south of France, and raise an army. His former allies, the ones who had once sworn loyalty to him, would rally to his cause again. He would return to Paris, and the people would welcome him as their emperor. The royalist government, weak and unstable, would fall to the power of his legend. "Bertrand," Napoleon said, his voice low, almost to himself, "I will not die here. I will return to France. I will rise again." Bertrand looked at him, unsure of what to say. He had seen Napoleon in his prime, commanding legions, leading battles, and bending nations to his will. But now, in this exile, he was not sure whether the man who stood before him was a figure of genius or madness. "Sire," Bertrand said carefully, "you know the risks. The French government would never allow your return. The Allies will come for you. You will be hunted down." Napoleon turned toward him sharply, his eyes blazing with the same intensity that had carried him through the many trials of his life. "I am Napoleon Bonaparte. I have faced worse odds than this and survived. Do you not believe in me, General? Do you not believe in what we have accomplished?" Bertrand hesitated for a moment, then bowed his head. "I believe in you, sire. Always. But I fear the road you are about to take will only lead to more destruction." Napoleon's expression softened, though only slightly. He placed a hand on Bertrand's shoulder, a gesture of familiarity and gratitude. "I know what you fear. But I cannot live like this, General. I cannot die here on this island, a prisoner of my own fate. I will go back to France, and I will reclaim what is mine." The decision was made, and there was no turning back. Napoleon's mind was set, and the idea of returning to France consumed him. Elba, with its isolation and quiet, had no place for him now. He had spent enough time on this island contemplating his fate, and now, with every passing day, it became more unbearable. The prospect of returning to France, of once again leading an army, of being welcomed as the emperor, these were the thoughts that fueled him now. His power was not gone, it simply needed to be awakened again. In the days that followed, Napoleon began to put his plan into motion. His loyal followers began to rally, speaking in whispers of escape and rebellion. Some were skeptical, others reluctant, but all of them knew what their emperor wanted. Napoleon had never been one to accept defeat, and as long as he lived, he would not allow the memory of his empire to fade quietly into history. His ambition, once the driving force of his rise, would not let him rest until it had once again reshaped the world. Elba, the place of his exile, would not be his final chapter. No, Napoleon Bonaparte would return to the world stage, and the empire he had lost would be his once more. The night was quiet on the shores of Elba, the sounds of waves lapping gently against the rocky coastline blending with the silence of the moonlit sky. The island, with its rugged hills and isolated beauty, lay in a peaceful slumber, unaware that it was soon to become the epicenter of a storm that would once again shake the foundations of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte stood by his modest residence, his eyes fixed on the stars. The cool night air swept through the island, tugging at the edges of his cloak, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, filled with the echoes of his decision, a decision that had already begun to alter the course of his life. The escape from Elba was no longer just a plan, it was a certainty. The fires of ambition that had once burned so brightly in him, driving him from triumph to triumph, had never been extinguished. They had only been dormant, waiting for the right moment, for the right opportunity. And now, that moment had arrived. The man who had once been the master of Europe, who had shaped the destinies of nations with a single command, was preparing to take back what he had lost. His exile had been a bitter pill to swallow, but it had only strengthened his resolve. The world had witnessed his downfall at Leipzig, but Napoleon would not allow that defeat to define him. He had risen before, from the ashes of his early life to the pinnacle of power. He could rise again. Behind him, the small group of loyal officers and soldiers who had accompanied him to Elba now gathered in the shadows, their faces obscured by the night, but their presence undeniable. Marshal Bertrand, General Drouet, and a handful of others, men who had stood by him through the worst of times, were now ready to follow him into the unknown. They had pledged their loyalty to him, not just as their leader, but as the man who had given them purpose, who had made them part of something greater than themselves. They had seen the fall of the empire, and they had felt the sting of defeat, but they were still with him. They believed in Napoleon. And now, they would risk everything for him once again. Napoleon turned to them, his eyes gleaming with the same steely determination that had carried him to the heights of power. The wind whipped through his hair, the lines of age and worry visible on his face, but his posture was unwavering. In that moment, he was not a man broken by defeat, but the same fierce leader who had once commanded the loyalty of millions. Tomorrow, Napoleon began, his voice low but filled with purpose. We begin the next chapter. We will sail from this island, and we will return to France. The people will remember us. They will remember what we built, and they will rise once more to stand with us. His words hung in the air, as though the very essence of his ambition had taken shape around them. The men before him, the men who had followed him through countless battles, now listened intently, their faces a mixture of awe, apprehension, and excitement. They had lived through the empire's glory, and they had endured its collapse. But the promise of a return, of a resurgence of their former greatness, was a powerful thing. You have all pledged your lives to this cause, Napoleon continued, his gaze sweeping over each of them. And now, you will see the fruits of that loyalty. The path ahead will not be easy. The road will be filled with danger, and our enemies will stop at nothing to see us fail. But we have something they do not, something they can never take from us. Napoleon paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. His eyes gleamed with intensity, his mind already moving ahead, plotting the next steps in his campaign. We have the will to succeed, he declared. We have the spirit of the empire, the blood of those who fought and died for our cause. That is what will carry us through. And when we land on the shores of France, when the people see us, they will rally to our side once again. The monarchy will fall, and the empire will rise. There was a long silence. The men stood still, their gazes locked on Napoleon, their faces unreadable. Then, slowly, one by one, they nodded. They knew the risks. They understood the enormity of what they were about to undertake. The Allies, the forces that had brought Napoleon down once before, would certainly not allow him to return to France without a fight. But they also knew the man before them. He was not a leader who would back down from such challenges. He had weathered countless storms in his life, and he had always come out victorious. A quiet murmur of agreement passed through the group, and then Marshal Bertrand stepped forward. His face was grave, but there was no doubt in his voice when he spoke. Sire, we are with you. We have always been with you. Napoleon gave a small nod of approval. He could feel the weight of their loyalty, the strength of their commitment. It was a bond that could never be broken. For all his brilliance and ambition, it was this loyalty, this bond of shared purpose, that had carried him through the darkest times. We sail at dawn, Napoleon said, his voice resolute. Prepare yourselves. We will leave Elba behind, and we will return to the world that once belonged to us. The men nodded and began to disperse, each of them heading toward the preparations that were already underway. There was much to do. The ship had been secured, the supplies gathered, and the plans set in motion. It would not be long before they were on their way, before they set sail into the night, bound for the shores of France and the world that awaited them. Napoleon turned back to the sea, his gaze lingering on the horizon. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders, and he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He could feel the pull of France, the land that had once been his to command, and he could almost hear the voices of his soldiers, his people, calling him home. He had been exiled, cast aside as though he were nothing more than a defeated relic of the past. But that was not who he was. That was not his fate. He had risen from nothing before, and he would rise again. The fire in his heart, the fire that had fueled his every step for so many years, was still burning brightly. And so, with the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon, Napoleon turned away from the cliffs and began to make his way to the waiting ship. His journey was about to begin once more, the journey back to France, to the people who would once again embrace him as their emperor, to the empire that would rise from the ashes of the past. The world had not seen the last of Napoleon Bonaparte. The morning of the 26th of February 1815 was crisp and clear, as though the sky itself was giving Napoleon a silent blessing. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the waters of the Mediterranean. The island of Elba, which had been his home for nearly a year, now felt like a distant memory, a brief interlude in a life that had once been defined by grandeur and ambition. But Napoleon knew that his time on the island was over. Today, he would set sail, and the course of history would shift once more. The small group of loyal soldiers, officers, and generals who had stood by him since his exile were already gathered at the dock, their faces a mixture of excitement, apprehension, and unwavering loyalty. The ship that would carry them from Elba to the coast of France sat quietly in the harbor, its sails furled, and its crew prepared. The smell of salt water hung in the air, and the rhythmic sound of waves breaking against the shore seemed to echo the beating of Napoleon's own heart. Napoleon stood at the edge of the pier, his tall figure silhouetted against the light of the morning. His coat, tattered from months of exile, fluttered slightly in the breeze, but he was no longer the same man who had arrived on this island. The years of triumph, the battles, the coronation, the empire, those were all distant memories now, far behind him. He had been cast down, discarded by the very forces he had once controlled. But today, that would all change. The fire that had fueled his rise to power was burning bright again, and he was ready to claim his destiny. General Bertrand stepped forward and bowed slightly, his face grim but resolute. "Sire, the ship is ready. We can leave at any moment." Napoleon nodded, but there was no hesitation in his eyes. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would either seal his fate or return him to the throne. He had thought of little else in the months since his arrival on Elba, his mind constantly turning over the possibilities. He had considered every option, every danger, and still he had made his decision. There could be no other path. To die in exile, to allow his name to fade from history, no, that was not his fate. He would rise again. He had to. "Let us be off, then," Napoleon said, his voice calm but filled with the authority that had once commanded armies and nations. He turned and began to walk towards the ship, his boots echoing sharply on the wooden pier. Behind him, Bertrand, Drouet, and the rest of his loyal officers followed in silence, their expressions a mixture of determination and uncertainty. They had heard the whispers, the rumors, of what would happen if Napoleon were to return to France. The monarchy, fragile and vulnerable, was still reeling from the aftermath of the revolution and the wars that had torn the country apart. And the Allies, Austria, Russia, Prussia, Britain, they would not sit idly by if Napoleon made a move. They had sworn to crush him if he ever returned to power. But despite the risks, the officers followed him without question. They had seen the greatness of Napoleon, the brilliance that had once reshaped Europe. They knew that if anyone could defy the odds, it was him. As Napoleon stepped aboard the ship, the crew immediately sprang into action, unfastening the ropes and unfurling the sails. The ship creaked as it began to move, slowly at first, and then with greater speed as the wind caught the canvas. The island of Elba began to shrink behind them, a small, solitary dot in the vast expanse of the Mediterranean. But for Napoleon, there was no looking back. The world that lay ahead was his to conquer, and he would not be denied. As the ships sailed further away from the island, the sea stretched out before them, a limitless expanse of water and sky. Napoleon stood at the bow, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing into the distance. His mind was already far from the shores of Elba. He was thinking of the journey ahead, of the soldiers who would rally to his cause, of the people who would rise up and greet him as their emperor, of the throne of France that would once again be his. But as the hours passed and the ship continued its steady course toward France, the reality of what lay ahead began to set in. The island of Elba was behind him, but the risks of his return were enormous. The French government, led by King Louis XVIII, would not welcome him back. The Allies, who had united to bring him down after Waterloo, would surely seek to stop him. And yet, there was something undeniable in Napoleon's mind, the conviction that he was the rightful ruler of France, that the empire he had built and lost was his to reclaim. As the ship sailed on, the crew worked quietly, preparing for what they all knew would be a perilous journey. But there was no fear in their eyes, only the certainty of their loyalty to the man who had once been their emperor. Napoleon's presence was magnetic. Even now, in the face of such danger, they were inspired by him, driven by his vision of a renewed France, a France restored to its former glory. In the early afternoon, as the ship cut through the waves with greater speed, Napoleon stood once more at the edge of the ship, watching the waves crash against the hull. His thoughts drifted back to the people of France, the farmers, the workers, the soldiers. He had always seen himself as their protector, their leader. The monarchy had failed them, and Napoleon knew that the royalists could not give them the stability and power they needed. Only he could do that. General Bertrand approached, his footsteps soft on the wooden deck. "Sire," he said quietly, "we are close now. The coast of France is within reach." Napoleon turned to face him, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "We will land soon. And when we do, we will reclaim what is rightfully ours. The people will see us. They will hear our call. And they will remember." Bertrand nodded, though there was still a hint of concern in his eyes. "And what of the army? Do you think they will rally to us so quickly?" Napoleon's eyes hardened. "They will. The army is loyal to the empire, and they will not stand idly by as a foreign king takes their country. They will rally to the flag of the empire, and the rest of France will follow. We must be strong, General. We must show them that the spirit of France has not been broken." The wind shifted, and the ship began to pick up speed as they neared the southern coast of France. Napoleon could feel the pulse of the land beneath his feet, the land that had once been his to command. His heart raced not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to happen. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would define his legacy. It would be a triumph or a tragedy, but it was a risk he was willing to take. The ship continued its journey, and as the sun began to set, the outline of the French coast came into view. Napoleon stood tall at the bow, his face set in determination, the winds of fate now in his favor. He had been exiled, cast aside, but he would not be forgotten. This was not the end of his story, it was the beginning of a new chapter. The world would soon know that Napoleon Bonaparte was back. And this time, he would not be denied. The night had fallen, and the ship's journey was nearing its climax. The waters of the Mediterranean were dark and still, the moonlight reflecting off the surface in a silvery sheen. The wind had grown stronger, urging the sails forward faster, as if the very forces of nature were conspiring to carry Napoleon back to the land that he had once ruled. The outlines of the French coast grew larger with every passing moment, and with each wave, the weight of the impending confrontation settled heavily upon the shoulders of Napoleon and his loyal officers. Napoleon stood at the bow of the ship, his posture regal despite the humbling journey behind him. His cloak fluttered slightly in the breeze, and his sharp eyes were fixed on the distant shore of France. This moment was a long time in the making. The island of Elba, with all its isolation and the bitter taste of exile, was far behind him now, and ahead lay the land he had once shaped with his own hands, a land that had been in turmoil ever since his fall. As the ship sliced through the waves, General Bertrand approached, his figure casting a shadow in the dim light of the moon. He had been by Napoleon's side for many years, and though his loyalty was unwavering, even he could not ignore the weight of what was ahead. "Sire," Bertrand began softly, "we are almost there. The people are waiting, but so are the soldiers. They've heard the rumors, and the road we travel now will not be an easy one." Napoleon glanced at his general, his gaze intense, as though every word Bertrand spoke only fueled the fire of his resolve. "I am not afraid of what lies ahead, General. I never have been," Napoleon replied, his voice firm, though tinged with the weariness of years spent in exile. Bertrand nodded in quiet understanding. He had seen the toll exile had taken on his emperor, but the fire in his eyes had never died. He had always known that Napoleon would not go quietly into history. He would fight for his legacy, for his empire, until the very end. "Do you truly believe the army will rally to you so swiftly?" Bertrand asked, a hint of doubt in his voice. Napoleon's eyes softened, but his expression remained resolute. I have no doubt. The soldiers of France remember the glory of the Empire. They remember our victories. The monarchy has failed them. It is time for the people to rise up, to reclaim what is theirs. He paused, his voice quiet, but filled with a certain kind of weight that came with years of thought and preparation. And when the army sees me, when they hear my call, they will follow. It is not a matter of if, General, but when. The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted the conversation, and Marshal Drouet, one of Napoleon's most trusted generals, joined the two men. He was a steady presence, always calm in the face of uncertainty. His face, though worn by years of conflict, radiated confidence. Sire, Drouet said with a bow, we have passed the last of the coastal watchmen. The coast is clear for us to land. But we will have little time to waste once we reach land. The enemy is already on alert. Napoleon nodded. The news did not surprise him. The monarchy, ever fragile and paranoid of any threat, would surely have been monitoring the coast since his escape from Elba. Word of his return would have spread like wildfire, and Louis XVIII's government would have already made preparations for his arrival. But this was not a fight he feared. It was the fight he had been waiting for. Then we land at once, Napoleon ordered, his voice sharp. We will waste no time. We will be on French soil before they can even comprehend what is happening. As the ship neared the shore, the crew worked quickly, pulling on ropes, adjusting the sails, and preparing the ship for the landing. The men, though battle-hardened, felt a rush of anticipation. This was not just another campaign. This was the return of an emperor, a man who had changed the course of European history, a man who had been toppled and exiled, but had now returned to reclaim his birthright. The ship began to slow as it approached the rocky coastline of Provence. In the distance, the first lights of the small villages began to twinkle in the dark, the only signs of life on an otherwise quiet shore. Napoleon, standing tall at the ship's helm, surveyed the coastline, his eyes scanning for any signs of resistance. His mind was already working through the strategies that would follow the landing. This was the first step. Once his feet touched the soil of France, there would be no turning back. As the ship drew closer to the shore, the sound of the waves grew louder, and the anticipation on board was palpable. The crew began to prepare the boats that would carry Napoleon and his officers to land. The soldiers readied themselves for the moment of action, checking their weapons and securing their positions. Napoleon turned to his men one final time before disembarking, his gaze sweeping over the group of loyal officers and soldiers who had joined him on this perilous journey. My friends, he said, his voice strong, this is the moment we have waited for. France needs us. The people need us. We will bring France back to glory. Together, we will restore the empire. Let them see that we have returned, and let them see that nothing can stop us. The men nodded, their eyes filled with renewed determination. They had heard these words before, many times during the years of war and victory, but they had never lost their power. Napoleon's ability to inspire loyalty was unmatched, and for these men, his call to arms was enough to drive them to the ends of the earth. As the boats hit the shore with a thud, Napoleon stepped down from the ship, his boots touching the soil of France for the first time in over a year. The feeling was almost surreal. It felt like the past and future were merging at this very moment. The people would soon learn of his return, and they would know that the emperor was back, ready to lead them once again. The soldiers disembarked behind him, their boots sinking into the sand as they lined up, ready for whatever would come next. The night was still, but there was a sense of electricity in the air, as though the very earth beneath their feet was waiting for the spark of rebellion to ignite. Napoleon turned and looked back at the ship. The figure of the captain stood at the bow, his silhouette outlined by the moonlight. The crew had done their part, bringing him safely to the shores of France. Now, the rest of the battle lay before him. With a deep breath, Napoleon looked back to the road ahead, where his future, and the future of Europe, would be determined. The rest of France was still unaware of the man who had come ashore to reclaim what was his. But Napoleon knew that in the days to come, they would hear his name. And when they did, they would rally to him. It was time to begin again. The empire was rising once more. The dawn of the 1st of March, 1815, broke cold and crisp over the rugged landscapes of southern France. The quiet serenity of the morning contrasted starkly with the storm that was beginning to stir in the hearts of the people. Napoleon Bonaparte, the once omnipotent emperor, was no longer a mere figure of history, an exiled relic of the past. He had returned, with the tide of ambition at his back, to reclaim the throne he had lost. Napoleon stood on the edge of a small hill overlooking the land that lay before him, the dust of his journey still clinging to his boots, the wind tugging at the edges of his dark coat. The night had passed uneventfully, but he knew the storm was approaching, and he could feel it in his bones. This moment, as fleeting as it might seem, would define his legacy. Either he would rise once more to glory, or he would fall for the last time. The soldiers who had landed with him on the shores of France were now gathered around him, their faces grim, but their eyes gleaming with the same fire that burned in his. Napoleon's men, his loyal officers, the generals who had fought with him in countless campaigns, and the common soldiers who had followed him through the blood and smoke of battle, were with him. They were the foundation of his empire, and now they stood ready to take the first steps toward rebuilding it. Behind them, the small village of Golfiwan was quiet, unaware of the storm that was about to break upon it. The morning stillness made it seem like any other day, but Napoleon knew that within hours, the entire nation would know that he had returned. He turned to General Bertrand, who had been with him since his days as emperor. The man had aged with grace, but his loyalty had not wavered in the slightest. Bertrand's face was stern, as it had always been, but there was a flicker of excitement behind his eyes. "Sire," Bertrand said quietly, "the time has come. The road ahead is uncertain, but the soldiers are ready to follow you. It's said that the people in the region are already beginning to hear rumors. We need to make our move before the royalist forces can organize." Napoleon nodded, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the horizon. "We move at once. We cannot afford hesitation. Once the people know, once the army knows, we will be unstoppable. The revolution that began in 1789 was never truly finished. We are the ones to carry it forward." Bertrand and the others fell into formation around Napoleon. The small army of roughly 1,000 men stood ready for action, some of whom were veterans of his past campaigns, while others were fresh recruits who had only heard of the glory of the empire in stories. The men had pledged their loyalty to Napoleon for one reason only: he had given them a cause, a vision for France that transcended mere politics. Under his rule, they had been soldiers, part of something greater than themselves. Now they were soldiers again, ready to restore the empire that had fallen. Napoleon mounted his horse with the swift ease of a man who had once ridden through the most dangerous battlefields of Europe. The sound of hooves striking the earth echoed across the landscape as the men began to move forward, their eyes fixed on the horizon. As they made their way through the narrow roads, Napoleon's mind turned to the next phase of their campaign. The French army was large, but it was divided, with some soldiers loyal to the king and others loyal to the memory of the empire. His first objective was simple: to secure the loyalty of the army, to sway them to his side. Without the army, no empire could stand. Word of Napoleon's return was already spreading, carried by messengers, merchants, and spies. By the time he had made his way through the first few villages, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were shouts. The people, tired of the corruption and weakness of the Bourbon monarchy, remembered the years of prosperity and glory under Napoleon's rule. They remembered the pride they had felt when they were feared across Europe, when France was a true power. In the town of Caen, about 10 miles from Golfiwan, the mood was beginning to shift. The townspeople, initially skeptical, were now gathering along the roads, their curiosity piqued by the increasing rumors. In a small square, a few of Napoleon's soldiers, led by General Drouet, stopped and began to speak with some of the locals. The exchanges were short but meaningful, mostly questions of, "Is it true? Is he really back?" As the soldiers continued their march through the town, a few hundred loyal men had already begun to gather behind them, drawn by the same hope that Napoleon had always inspired in his followers. By the time they reached the outskirts of the town, more men had joined them, swelling the ranks to nearly 500. Napoleon, riding at the head of his army, could sense the change in the air. The first few dozen men were a trickle, but with every village they passed, the trickle turned into a flood. The cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" echoed across the hills as more and more joined the growing army. Word had reached the nearby military garrisons, and soldiers who had once fought under Napoleon's banner were now stepping forward, dropping their allegiance to Louis XVIII and once again pledging their loyalty to the man who had made France mighty. As the small army moved forward, Napoleon's heart began to race with anticipation. He knew that the most dangerous part of the journey was just ahead. The Royalist forces, though divided and lacking in coherence, would be waiting for him. The monarchy, ever fragile, could not afford to let Napoleon regain a foothold in France without a fight. But Napoleon did not fear the Royalist forces. They were divided and weak, and their leadership had never been able to inspire the same kind of loyalty that he commanded. The next morning, as they approached the city of Aix-en-Provence, the first real battle of his return seemed inevitable. The Royalists had learned of his arrival, and they had mobilized a small force to meet him. The Royalist troops, though more numerous, lacked the resolve that Napoleon's men had. They had not fought beside their emperor in the fields of Europe. They had not shared the camaraderie of the soldiers who had followed Napoleon to the heights of glory and the depths of exile. Napoleon gathered his officers in a small room just outside the town's gates. The air was thick with tension, the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. "This is it," Napoleon said, his voice steady but charged with the urgency of the moment. "We have the people on our side, and we have the army behind us. We will break them here. The Royalists cannot stand against us, not with their divided ranks. We will strike fast, we will strike hard, and we will show France that the Empire is back." General Bertrand stepped forward, a map of the town spread out before him. "Sire, we've gathered intelligence on the Royalist forces. They're entrenched in the town square. We will need to break their lines quickly and decisively." Napoleon nodded. "We will lead them into the trap. Our men are fired up, and their loyalty will carry us to victory. We shall see how far their loyalty to the monarchy truly extends. We shall see if they are ready to fight for a weak king, or if they remember the strength and glory of the empire." With that, the army prepared for battle. Napoleon gave one last glance to his growing forces, men ready for the fight, men eager to restore the empire to its former glory. The clash that followed would be the beginning of the final phase of his grand return to power. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once ruled Europe, was about to face his first major test in his effort to reclaim the throne of France. And this time, there would be no turning back. The morning fog still hung over the city of Aix-en-Provence as Napoleon's army prepared for the confrontation ahead. The town, typically calm and peaceful, was now the stage for a battle that would determine the course of France's future. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the muffled sounds of Napoleon's soldiers assembling, readying their weapons, and adjusting their formations. The morning light, pale and weak, filtered through the haze, casting an almost dreamlike glow over the landscape. But to Napoleon, there was no time for reflection or hesitation. The battlefield was set. The Royalist forces, though outnumbering Napoleon's men, were in a disarray of their own making. Their commander, an officer loyal to Louis XVIII, had little experience in commanding against a force as well drilled and motivated as Napoleon's. Napoleon knew that their advantage in numbers could easily be undone by the unity and fervor of his own army. His soldiers had already proven their loyalty and were eager to fight for the cause they had longed for, restoring the glory of the empire. Napoleon paced back and forth in the war room, a small building tucked just outside the town's gates. General Bertrand stood by a table, studying a map of Aix-en-Provence, while other officers murmured in low voices. The tension in the room was palpable. This battle would be the first major test of Napoleon's return, and the weight of history hung heavily on each decision made. "The Royalists are dug in," Bertrand said, tracing his finger along the map. "Their forces are concentrated near the square. It's a defensive position, and they will try to hold us there. Their cavalry is scattered to the east, and their infantry is mostly positioned along the main streets leading to the square. Napoleon listened intently, his sharp eyes fixed on the map. They will underestimate us, he muttered to himself. They believe we are just a rabble of rebels, but they forget that I have led armies against the greatest powers of Europe. They forget that the spirit of France can never be crushed. He looked up at his officers, his gaze piercing. We will strike quickly and decisively. The Royalists are slow, and they are fractured. They will not know how to respond to our speed. We will strike from the west and force them to commit their forces to one front. Once they are engaged, we will hit them hard on the flanks. Their lines will break, and when they break, we will show the people of France that their emperor has returned. General Drouet, a man of few words but immense loyalty, spoke next. Sire, we have men in the rear to secure a retreat if necessary, but I believe the battle will be over before it comes to that. We need to move swiftly and crush them while they are still confused. Napoleon nodded. Exactly. They are disoriented. We will take advantage of that confusion. And when they see us, when they realize who leads them, they will scatter. Our men are ready. They know what is at stake. The tension in the room began to ease slightly as the plan came together. The officers exchanged brief nods, their expressions now hardening into determination. They had fought alongside Napoleon in battles across Europe, from the plains of Austerlitz to the sands of Egypt, and they had seen the glory of the empire rise and fall. But today, they were ready for that glory to return. Napoleon stepped forward, his boots heavy against the wooden floor, and looked each officer in the eye. We will win this day. The monarchy cannot stand. The people of France will see that we are the ones who will bring them the greatness they deserve. We fight not only for France, but for the soul of Europe itself. With that, the meeting was over. The officers departed, and Napoleon mounted his horse, his army assembling around him. The sound of boots marching in unison, the clinking of armor, and the low murmur of soldiers filled the air as the troops began to take their positions. As they moved out, the first rays of the sun began to break through the fog, casting long shadows over the town. The soldiers of Napoleon's army, energized by the promise of victory, moved with purpose. Their march was a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound, a prelude to the violence that would soon follow. Napoleon's eyes scanned the town as they approached. The streets were eerily quiet, and the windows of the houses were shuttered, as if the residents themselves were unsure of what was to come. But Napoleon knew the people were watching, waiting to see which side would claim victory. He knew that in the end, it would not just be the soldiers who would decide the outcome, it would be the hearts and minds of the people. If the Royalists won, the monarchy would remain, fragile and unpopular. But if Napoleon's army emerged victorious, the empire would return, and the people would once again rise in support of the man who had given them hope, power, and pride. As they approached the city gates, the Royalist troops could be seen in the distance. They had formed a defensive line near the square, but their numbers appeared scattered and uncertain. Napoleon could sense the fear among them. They had heard the rumors of his return, and now they were faced with the reality of it. He raised his hand, signaling the start of the attack. The first wave of Napoleon's forces surged forward with a terrifying speed. The cavalry, led by General Nancy, rode ahead to draw the Royalist forces out of their positions. The sound of hoofs pounding the ground filled the air, accompanied by the sharp clash of metal as they struck the first line of the Royalist defenses. The Royalist infantry, caught off guard by the swiftness of the assault, hesitated for just a moment too long, and that hesitation would cost them dearly. Napoleon, positioned with his infantry, led the charge down the narrow streets, his eyes locked on the square ahead. The soldiers around him surged forward, shouting cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" as they clashed with the Royalist defenders. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, with muskets firing, swords clashing, and the sounds of men grunting and yelling filling the streets. The Royalist lines faltered, then broke. The shock of Napoleon's swift and decisive action had left them disoriented, and in the chaos, many of the Royalist soldiers surrendered or fled. The cries of victory from Napoleon's men echoed through the streets, growing louder as they pushed forward. But Napoleon knew that the battle was not yet won. The Royalists would fight for their lives, and there were still pockets of resistance throughout the town. He spurred his horse forward, leading his men to secure the square, where the last of the Royalist defenders had gathered. In the square, the final stand of the Royalist forces was quickly crumbling. The Royalist commander, his face pale with fear, had tried to rally his troops, but it was too late. Napoleon's forces were closing in from all sides. The Royalists, outmatched and outclassed, turned and fled, leaving the square to Napoleon's army. The battle for Aix-en-Provence was over. Napoleon rode into the center of the square, his heart pounding in his chest. His soldiers, weary but triumphant, gathered around him. The victory was theirs. The first major obstacle had been overcome. The Royalists had been defeated, and Napoleon's path to reclaiming France was now open. But Napoleon did not allow himself to bask in the glory of the moment for long. He knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, and there would be many more battles to fight. But for now, he could feel the weight of history shifting in his favor. The people of Aix-en-Provence, having witnessed the swift defeat of the Royalist forces, emerged from their homes and cheered, waving French flags as they hailed their emperor. The streets filled with the cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" as Napoleon's men, and Napoleon himself, took their first steps in the rebirth of the French Empire. The monarchy had been dealt a blow, but the real battle was only just beginning. Napoleon's return was no longer a rumor, it was a reality, and the fate of France, and of Europe, would be decided in the days to come. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape as Napoleon's army moved forward from the town of Aix-en-Provence. The victory was complete, but the euphoria that had flooded his soldiers just hours earlier was beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet, almost somber realization that the real battle was yet to come. Napoleon knew that the defeat of the Royalists in Aix was just a first step, a prelude to the larger struggle ahead. The army had grown since the early hours of the battle. More men had joined Napoleon's ranks after hearing the news of his triumph. They had come from nearby villages, drawn to the sound of victory and to the possibility of a restored empire. By nightfall, his forces numbered well over 3,000, their spirits buoyed by the success of the day. Napoleon rode at the head of his column, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The victory had been swift and decisive, but he knew that the true test would come when he faced the forces loyal to Louis XVIII. The Royalist forces, though fragmented and poorly organized, would not surrender easily. They had the support of the monarchy's strongest allies, foreign powers that had once feared Napoleon's rise to power and now sought to ensure he did not return. Napoleon's mind was sharp as ever, calculating the next steps in his campaign. He would need to strike again before the Royalist forces could regroup. If they were allowed to consolidate their strength, they would become a formidable opponent. He could not afford hesitation, not now, not when the momentum was in his favor. As the army marched through the dusky roads, the sound of marching feet and the clinking of swords and muskets filled the air. There was an unmistakable sense of unity among the men, a bond that had been forged in countless battles across Europe. They were soldiers of the Empire, and they had returned to restore what had been lost. But Napoleon knew that he could not win this war alone. His army was loyal, yes, but there were other forces to consider, forces beyond France's borders. The great powers of Europe, the United Kingdom, Prussia, Russia, had all been keeping a wary eye on his return. They had not yet acted, but their response was inevitable. The moment they realized that Napoleon was truly back, they would join the cause to defeat him once more. "We need to move swiftly," Napoleon muttered to himself. He turned to his trusted aide-de-camp, General Bertrand, who had been by his side since the days of the Grande Armée. Bertrand was a man of few words, but he understood Napoleon better than anyone. "Where do we go next, sire?" he asked, his voice low. Napoleon looked around at the growing army, the men who had fought for him once and were now fighting again for the dream of an empire that stretched from Spain to Russia. "We march toward Grenoble," he said. "It is a key city that will allow us to establish control over the Rhone Valley. The Royalist forces are scattered, and I want to bring them together on my terms, not theirs." We strike before they have a chance to consolidate their forces. Bertrand nodded. He had seen Napoleon in action countless times, but there was something different now. The urgency was palpable. Napoleon was not the young, rising star of the revolution. He was the former emperor, returned from exile, and his thirst for victory had only grown stronger. As they rode, Napoleon's thoughts turned to the larger war, the war against the allies of the Bourbon monarchy. His eyes flicked over the darkening sky, thinking of the British, the Russians, the Austrians, and the Prussians. They had banded together to overthrow him once before, and they would do so again if they had to. Napoleon knew that his ultimate success would depend on whether he could gain the support of the French people and split the alliances of Europe. His forces might have grown for now, but they were nothing compared to the might of the combined armies of Europe. In his mind, Napoleon began to plan his next steps. Grenoble would be the key. He had the support of the people in the south, but he needed the loyalty of the army in the north. If he could capture Grenoble, he would have a strategic position from which to consolidate his power and move against the Royalists before they had time to organize. But the road to Grenoble would not be easy. The Royalist forces in the region had been preparing for his return for months, and the city was heavily fortified. Napoleon's mind turned to the tactical decisions ahead. He had no intention of laying siege to Grenoble, as the city was not an easy target. Instead, he would use his forces to outmaneuver the Royalists, isolating them in a way that would leave them vulnerable. He would use speed and surprise, the same tactics that had won him so many victories in the past. That night, the army camped outside the village of La Mure, a few miles from the foothills that led into the Alps. The air was cold, and the scent of wood smoke filled the camp as fires were lit. Napoleon walked through the camp, his officers and soldiers greeting him with respect as he passed. The faces of his men were weary from the day's march, but their eyes still burned with the same loyalty and fervor that had driven them to fight for him in the past. As Napoleon approached his tent, General Drouot came forward, holding a letter in his hand. "Sire, this just arrived," he said, his face grim. Napoleon took the letter, his eyes scanning the message. It was from Paris, and it contained important news about the political situation in the capital. Louis XVIII, it seemed, had finally realized the gravity of Napoleon's return. The king had summoned the royalist generals and military leaders to prepare for war. The Bourbon monarchy was no longer content to wait for Napoleon's next move. It was preparing to strike back. Napoleon folded the letter and handed it back to Drouot. "It is as we feared," he said, his voice cold. "The Allies will join forces with Louis XVIII. We will face them on every front." Drouot nodded solemnly. "We will be ready, sire." Napoleon paused for a moment, his eyes distant. The Royalist forces would certainly call for reinforcements. The coalition against him would grow. But there was one thing that Napoleon knew with absolute certainty: he was not alone in this fight. The loyalty of his soldiers, the enthusiasm of the French people, and the momentum of his campaign would give him the strength to stand against the combined armies of Europe once again. "We have no choice but to continue," Napoleon said, his voice now filled with resolve. "We will march on Grenoble and secure the Rhône Valley. Once we have that, the rest of France will follow. The Allies can't defeat us if we can win over the people." That night, as the army settled down for the evening, Napoleon retired to his tent. He had been at the head of an empire before, but this was different. This was no longer just about France, it was about his place in history. He had been exiled once, but he would not go quietly again. The stakes were higher than ever, and every decision from this point forward would determine the future of the empire he had built. In the quiet of his tent, Napoleon sat, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. The army he commanded was his greatest strength, but it was the people of France, their unwavering support, that would be the true test of his power. He would face great battles ahead, and the risks were high, but Napoleon Bonaparte was ready to face them. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this would be no different. Tomorrow, they would march on Grenoble. The real battle for the future of France, and for Napoleon's place in history, was about to begin. The sky was still dark when Napoleon's army began to move once more, the rhythmic sound of boots and hooves echoing through the valley. A thin mist clung to the ground, rising slowly as the sun's first light crept over the horizon. The cold air bit at the skin, but the soldiers of the Empire were resolute, their breath forming clouds in the crisp morning. They had been marching for hours, pushing through the night with a singular focus: Grenoble. Napoleon had made it clear, this city was key to his plans. By now, the news of his victory in Aix-en-Provence had spread like wildfire across southern France. The royalist forces were scrambling, unsure of how to react to the growing strength of Napoleon's resurgence. He had made his mark, and now it was time to press forward before the enemy had the chance to regroup and consolidate their defenses. Napoleon rode at the head of his army, his gaze steady and unflinching as the mountains of the Dauphiné region rose majestically before him. The terrain here was difficult, the roads narrow and winding, but Napoleon had led his troops through far worse. He had an intimate knowledge of these lands, having traversed them during his earlier campaigns. There was something almost poetic about the way his army moved, determined and unrelenting, pushing through the vast, unforgiving terrain of the French Alps. General Bertrand, riding alongside him, spoke briefly. "Sire, we are close to Grenoble now. The Royalists are entrenched in the hills, and scouts report that they are expecting our arrival." Napoleon nodded. "They will not be able to withstand the force of our attack. We will use their overconfidence against them." They had already begun to receive reports that the Royalists, though in greater numbers, were scattered and disorganized. The Royalist commander, General de Mialis, was a man who had earned his rank through loyalty to Louis XVIII but lacked the battlefield experience and strategic vision that Napoleon possessed. Napoleon knew that the Royalists would attempt to hold Grenoble, but their position would ultimately be their downfall. "I'll send my cavalry to the east," Napoleon continued, his voice low and decisive. "We will draw their attention away from the city. Meanwhile, our infantry will circle around to the west. They will be caught between two fires and will have nowhere to turn. The moment they panic, we will strike." Bertrand raised an eyebrow. "You intend to cut off their escape routes, sire?" Napoleon's lips curled into a slight smile. "Precisely. They will have no place to retreat to. They will either surrender or face complete destruction." The army continued its march, and as the mist began to lift, the jagged peaks of the Alps loomed ever closer. The thought of victory was now so near that it pulsed in the air around them, tangible and electric. Napoleon's soldiers could feel the shift in the atmosphere. They had been with him through thick and thin, through battles that had torn Europe apart, and now, under his command once again, they could sense that the Empire was on the verge of rebirth. By late afternoon, the army reached the outskirts of Grenoble. The city lay nestled in the foothills, a network of defensive fortifications lining the high ground. Its position in the valley made it an excellent stronghold, but it was also vulnerable to a well-executed attack. Napoleon observed the city from a distance, his eyes narrowed as he surveyed the Royalist defenses. "Prepare the men," he ordered. "We strike at nightfall. They will not expect it." As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the army moved into position. The sky turned an eerie orange, casting a golden glow over the rocky terrain. In the quiet of the dusk, there was a tense anticipation that ran through the ranks. The soldiers knew that tonight could change the course of their lives. They had rallied around Napoleon once before, during the rise of the Empire, and now they stood ready to do it again. Napoleon's mind was sharp as ever, his thoughts focused on every aspect of the impending attack. His strategy was clear. The cavalry would make the first move, feinting an attack to the east, drawing the Royalists' attention away from the true point of assault. Meanwhile, the infantry, moving under the cover of darkness, would slip into position on the western side of the city, where the Royalists had the weakest defenses. The hours leading up to the attack passed slowly. Napoleon's army moved with deliberate stealth, their movements precise, almost ghostly in the shadowed landscape. The men were ready. They had been trained for this moment, and they knew that the success of the mission depended on discipline, speed, and above all, surprise. As the night deepened, the tension grew. Napoleon sat on his horse at the head of the column, his eyes scanning the horizon. His presence alone inspired confidence in his soldiers, and as they approached the city, they moved with an almost eerie silence, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. The first sign that the attack had begun came from the cavalry. A distant rumble, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth, echoed through the valley. The Royalists, their senses dulled by a false sense of security, quickly turned their attention eastward, ready to repel what they believed was the main force of the attack. At that moment, Napoleon gave the signal. His infantry, moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine, surged forward, emerging from the shadows like ghosts in the night. They poured into the streets of Grenoble, catching the Royalists by complete surprise. The defenders, still reeling from the feint to the east, were unprepared for the onslaught from the west. Napoleon's troops were swift and relentless. The Royalist forces scrambled to form a defense, but they were already outflanked. The narrow streets of Grenoble became a battlefield, filled with the sounds of gunfire, the clash of steel, and the shouts of soldiers. The Royalists, disoriented and overwhelmed, fought back with desperation, but it was clear that their position was untenable. Napoleon, his eyes glowing with the fire of command, moved through the chaos with purpose. His officers followed close behind, issuing orders to their troops as the battle unfolded. The Royalists fought valiantly, but they were simply outmatched by the speed and coordination of Napoleon's forces. Hours passed in the heat of battle. The Royalist defenders, their will to fight quickly eroding, began to surrender. Napoleon's men pressed forward, methodically clearing the streets and securing key positions. By dawn, the battle was over. The Royalists had been decisively defeated. As the first light of morning broke over the horizon, Napoleon stood at the heart of the city, surveying the aftermath of the battle. His soldiers, exhausted but triumphant, gathered around him. The streets were littered with the remnants of the fight, fallen soldiers, broken weapons, and the shattered hopes of those who had fought against him. Napoleon turned to his generals, a look of satisfaction on his face. "The road to Paris is now open," he said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "We have taken Grenoble. The Royalists are finished here." The generals exchanged knowing glances. This victory was not just a tactical win, it was a statement. Napoleon had proven once again that his strategic brilliance and unyielding resolve could overcome any obstacle. The battle for Grenoble had been decisive, and now, with the city under his control, Napoleon had secured a foothold in the heart of France. But as Napoleon stood among his men, a lingering thought passed through his mind. The real struggle was still ahead. The Royalists, though defeated here, would not go quietly. And the coalition of European powers would soon turn their attention to him once more. But for now, Napoleon allowed himself a moment to savor the victory. The war was far from over, but he had taken the first major step toward reclaiming his empire. The quiet calm of the morning after the battle was a deceptive veil over the storm of activity that had begun to churn within the newly conquered Grenoble. As Napoleon stood at the heart of the city, his troops beginning to regroup and tend to their wounds, the weight of the battle ahead loomed large. The Royalists had been crushed here, but Napoleon knew full well that this victory was merely the beginning of his larger campaign to restore his empire. The true challenge lay not in this one city but in the looming confrontation with the combined forces of Europe, who, he knew, would soon turn their eyes upon him once more. Napoleon walked through the streets of Grenoble, his boots clicking against the cobblestone roads, the early morning sun now climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the city. The familiar feeling of being on the cusp of greatness filled his chest with purpose. His army, though fatigued from the long march and battle, stood tall with the pride of soldiers who had just crushed their enemies. They had not only won a battle, but they had proven their loyalty to the man who had once led them to glory. In the aftermath of the battle, the streets were lined with the defeated soldiers of the Royalist forces, many of them kneeling, hands raised in surrender, while others lay in the dirt, casualties of the fierce clash. The smoke from the fires of the night before still hung in the air, but it was beginning to clear, and the sounds of the city were slowly returning to normal. The occasional clink of armor and murmur of soldiers filled the space around Napoleon as he moved through the ranks, his face impassive, his mind calculating the next steps. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, the sense that history itself was watching. This was a pivotal moment, the first of many more to come, and he had no intention of wasting it. His soldiers had already begun rounding up prisoners, securing the perimeter, and ensuring that any pockets of resistance were swiftly neutralized. But there was more to be done. Much more. He stopped in front of a cluster of soldiers, giving a brief nod to his general, Francois, who had been overseeing the capture of the royalist stronghold on the northern edge of the city. Francois, a seasoned veteran with a sharp eye for detail, approached him with a look of both respect and caution. "Sire," Francois began, his voice firm but respectful, "the city is secured. The enemy forces that were in the city have either surrendered or fled. There are still pockets of royalists scattered in the hills, but they pose little threat now. We can move forward with our plans." Napoleon nodded thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the horizon, where the morning mist still lingered over the hills surrounding Grenoble. He had been expecting this: scattered resistance, remnants of the royalist army still hoping to regroup and fight on. It was inevitable. Napoleon had learned long ago that to truly defeat an army, one needed to crush both its forces and its spirit. To destroy an enemy was to ensure that it could never rise again. "Good," Napoleon replied simply. "But I will not take any chances. Send word to our cavalry to track down any remnants of the royalists. I want them crushed before they have a chance to regroup." Francois gave a nod of assent, turning to relay the orders. As he did, Napoleon's thoughts turned to the wider conflict that was already brewing across Europe. The great powers, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Britain, would not sit idle for long. The battle at Grenoble had been a victory for him, but in the grander scheme, it was only a small part of the larger struggle. The royalist forces loyal to Louis XVIII were beaten, but the combined forces of Europe were a different matter entirely. They had fought him once before, and they would not hesitate to march against him again. Napoleon felt the weight of this looming threat, but there was something else stirring within him, a fire, an unshakable confidence that he had always carried with him, even in the darkest of times. He knew what needed to be done. His goal was not just to reclaim the throne of France, it was to restore the glory of the French Empire, to bring Europe to its knees, and to ensure that his name would forever be etched in history. He turned away from the scene of the aftermath of battle, his mind already working, already formulating the next steps in his campaign. There would be no time to waste. The royalists were finished here, but the true battle for France's future was still ahead. He had taken the first step, but now he needed to secure the loyalty of the people, especially in the north, where the royalists had deep support. If he could rally the people behind him, if he could win their hearts and minds, the combined forces of Europe would be forced to contend with a France united under his banner. As Napoleon continued walking through the city, he made his way to a high vantage point overlooking the central square. From here, he could see the bustling life of Grenoble slowly returning to its usual pace, the citizens cautiously observing the change in power. He had already begun issuing proclamations to assure the people that he had come to restore the glory of France and that their safety was paramount. His messages were clear and direct. Those who pledged allegiance to him would be protected, but anyone who resisted would face swift consequences. The royalist supporters were already beginning to understand what this meant. Napoleon had made no secret of his resolve, and they knew better than to test his will. As for the people who had remained neutral or fearful during the turmoil, Napoleon had no doubt that he would win them over in time. He had a gift for inspiring loyalty, for making the people believe in him, and he would use every resource at his disposal to ensure that the French people would rally to his side. But even as he considered these matters, his mind was constantly flickering back to the larger picture, the looming war with the European coalitions. The forces arrayed against him were formidable, but he had faced overwhelming odds before and triumphed. If there was one thing Napoleon was certain of, it was that he could turn even the most desperate situations into opportunities for glory. Back in the heart of Grenoble, the city began to settle into a new order. The resistance had been subdued, and the prisoners were being gathered, ready to be transported for interrogation. Napoleon knew that some of them might hold crucial information about the royalist plans in the region, about the movements of other loyalist forces, and possibly even about the strategies being formulated by Europe's enemies. He needed every scrap of intelligence to fuel his campaign. By the time evening fell, Napoleon had already begun formulating his next moves. The news of his victory at Grenoble would spread quickly across the country, and it would only be a matter of time before his next battle, whether it came in the form of royalist insurgencies or the armies of Europe, was upon him. He knew that this war would be like none before it. There would be no easy road to victory, but he had never been a man to shy away from such challenges. And so, with the city of Grenoble now under his control, Napoleon prepared for the next phase of his campaign. The Royalists had been defeated in one of the most important strongholds in the south, but the war was far from over. He had returned to France, and the battle for his empire was only just beginning. The night before the assault on Lyon was calm, but the weight of anticipation hung in the air. Napoleon sat alone in his tent, a map of the region spread out before him. The camp was quiet, the soldiers resting after a long day's march, but there was an undercurrent of energy that buzzed through the night, palpable in the way the soldiers moved with purpose, in the quick exchanges of their officers, in the tension that filled the campfires. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end of royalist resistance. Lyon would fall, and with it, the last stronghold of the French royalists in the south. After Lyon, Paris, capital of the empire, would be within reach. But the shadow of the European coalitions loomed large, and Napoleon knew that their forces were already mobilizing. Napoleon's mind was alive with thoughts of the campaign. Lyon was a vital city, strategically placed at the confluence of the Rhône and Saône rivers, its defenses bolstered by both its natural geography and the remaining royalist forces that had gathered there. The city had been a thorn in the side of the French Revolution since its early days, and now it represented the last significant resistance to his return. He could not afford to underestimate the strength of its defenders, but at the same time, he had the advantage. His army had grown, and his soldiers were eager for battle. They had tasted victory, and their morale was high. His strategy was clear: move fast, strike hard, and leave no room for the royalists to regroup. The sound of footsteps approached from behind, and Napoleon didn't have to turn to know who it was. His trusted general, Bertrand, entered the tent, bringing with him a map of Lyon and the surrounding area. "Sire, the scouts report that the royalists are dug in along the city's outer defenses," Bertrand said, his tone calm but filled with the urgency of their mission. "They've fortified the eastern and southern approaches, but the northern side is weaker. The river could work in our favor, though it may also present some difficulties with our heavy artillery." Napoleon examined the map, his eyes tracing the contours of the river and the defensive positions of the enemy. "The northern approach," he muttered to himself. "We can make use of the river for a surprise attack. We will concentrate our forces there and use our artillery to soften the defenses from a distance. We'll keep the southern and eastern fronts contained to prevent any escape." Bertrand nodded. "The men are ready. The cavalry will move first, drawing the enemy's attention away from our true position. They won't expect us to strike where they are weakest." Napoleon's eyes narrowed as he considered the plan. He had always relied on speed and deception, and this plan would be no different. He had learned long ago that wars were not won just by sheer might but by cunning and strategic advantage. The royalists in Lyon would be cornered before they even realized it. "Send word to the commanders," Napoleon ordered. "I want the attack to begin at first light. We hit them hard and fast, and we keep them off balance. There will be no retreat. I want Lyon secured by the end of the day." Bertrand bowed slightly before stepping back to carry out his orders. Napoleon's gaze lingered on the map for a moment longer before he rolled it up and handed it to an aide. The sounds of the camp around him began to fade as he retreated into his own thoughts. The weight of the moment settled over him like a heavy cloak. Lyon was the final obstacle before Paris, but even more than that, it was a symbol. A symbol of the royalists' last stand, of the old order's resistance against the tide of revolution. To take Lyon would be to strike a mortal blow to that resistance. It would cement his return to power and further erode the legitimacy of Louis XVIII's claims. But there was no time for reflection. The next phase of his campaign was at hand, and there was no room for doubt. He had conquered Europe before. He would do it again. As the fire in the center of the camp flickered and crackled, Napoleon glanced around the tent. His generals were gathered, each absorbed in their own thoughts, yet all committed to the same singular goal: to restore the empire, to reignite the glory of France, to return the nation to its rightful place at the center of Europe. Napoleon knew that his soldiers were as much a part of that dream as he was. They were not just fighting for a leader, they were fighting for the future of France. And for that, they would give everything. The night passed slowly. Napoleon's thoughts were interrupted by the low hum of activity outside his tent. Orders were being passed, soldiers were preparing, and the sound of hooves could be heard as the cavalry rode out to scout the terrain. By dawn, the first rays of sunlight were beginning to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the camp. Napoleon stood, stretching his stiff limbs, and made his way outside. The air was cold, crisp, but there was a sharpness to it, a clarity that only came before battle. He mounted his horse with practiced ease, his generals falling in line behind him. His gaze moved over the ranks of his troops, who stood at attention, their faces set with determination. They knew what was at stake. This would be a battle like any other, but this time, it would be different. Napoleon was no longer a man in exile. He was the emperor, and the world would bend to his will. With a signal from Napoleon, the army began to move, marching forward in perfect unison, their boots hitting the ground in a rhythm that echoed through the camp. The cavalry moved ahead, their figures small against the rising sun, scouting ahead for any sign of the enemy. The rest of the army followed, ready to strike. As they neared Lyon, Napoleon could feel the tension in the air. The enemy was readying themselves for a fight, but they were unaware of the trap being set. The French forces would close in from all sides, leaving the Royalists with no place to run. Their fate had already been sealed. Napoleon urged his horse forward, leading his army to the northern side of the city, where the river could serve as both a shield and a weapon. The sound of artillery being readied echoed through the ranks, and Napoleon's heart began to race in anticipation. This would be a battle of speed and precision. The Royalists had no idea what was coming. The cavalry moved quickly, creating a diversion along the eastern approach, while the main force, under Napoleon's command, would close in from the north. As the first shots rang out, the battle began. The soldiers, driven by the knowledge that victory was within their grasp, surged forward. The roar of cannons filled the air, and the battlefield became a chaotic blur of noise and movement. Napoleon's forces pushed through the city's outskirts, cutting down the defenders with ruthless efficiency. The Royalists were caught off guard, their positions disorganized. What had once been a fortified city was now falling to the might of the French army. Napoleon moved with his troops, directing the flow of battle with calculated precision. Every maneuver, every charge was made with the goal of overwhelming the enemy, of ensuring that Lyon would not be allowed to stand as a symbol of defiance. His soldiers, emboldened by their leader's presence, fought with unparalleled vigor, determined to prove that the emperor had returned to restore France to its rightful place. The Royalists, though fierce in their defense, were no match for the force that was bearing down upon them. Lyon's defenses crumbled, and as the day wore on, it became clear that the city was lost. Napoleon stood amidst the battle, his figure cutting through the chaos, a beacon of leadership in the storm. His army was unstoppable, and Lyon, like Grenoble before it, would soon be another triumph in his campaign to reclaim his empire. The Royalist resistance was breaking. And soon Napoleon would claim victory not only for Lyon, but for all of France. The road to Paris, and ultimately to Europe's throne, was now wide open. As the final echoes of gunfire faded into the distance, Napoleon stood on the outskirts of Lyon, watching the city burn. The smoke curled into the sky, casting a dark pall over what had once been a Royalist stronghold. The streets, now littered with the remnants of battle, were a testament to the brutality of the day. The city had fallen, and with it, the last significant resistance in southern France. The Royalist forces had been crushed, their morale shattered, their remnants scattered. Napoleon's eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the landscape before him. Lyon had been his prize, his victory. The plan had unfolded with the precision he had anticipated, swift, overwhelming, and devastating. The Royalists had underestimated his cunning, his ability to maneuver his forces with a speed and efficiency that left them no time to react. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the last remnants of the city's defenses crumbled. The Royalists, once so confident in their position, were now fleeing in disarray. The streets that had been filled with fervor just hours earlier were now eerily silent, save for the crackling of the remaining fires. Napoleon had ordered his forces to secure the city quickly and efficiently, not allowing the defenders any chance to regroup. His artillery had pounded the outer walls, and his infantry had pressed forward, cutting through the Royalist lines like a hot knife through butter. The cavalry had been swift, striking at key positions and ensuring that the Royalists had no chance of escape. It had been a brilliant tactical maneuver, one that would be remembered in the annals of military history. But despite the victory, Napoleon did not feel the thrill of conquest he once did. He stood motionless, his face a mask of stoic resolve. The victory was necessary, of course, but it was only a part of a larger game, a game that would take him much farther than the streets of Lyon. Paris, the heart of France, was within his grasp now. But the war was far from over. The coalition forces were still marching toward him. The armies of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain would not allow him to rise unchecked. They were coming, and Napoleon could feel the weight of that impending clash with each passing moment. His generals gathered around him, their faces grim but filled with the certainty of triumph. General Bertrand, ever the loyal officer, stepped forward. "Sire, Lyon is secure. The Royalist forces have been routed. The city is ours," Bertrand said, his voice filled with pride. But even as he spoke, there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "The soldiers are eager for their rest, and the men are ready to march. The next step is Paris." Napoleon nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. He knew what was at stake. The battle for Lyon had been a necessary step, but the true struggle lay ahead. Paris was a prize worth fighting for, but it would not be easily won. The city was fortified, and the Royalists there, loyal to Louis XVIII, would not surrender without a fight. "We will not waste time," Napoleon said coldly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We march on Paris. The enemy will think we will rest here, but we will not give them the chance to regroup. We strike now, before they can consolidate their forces." Bertrand raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "But sire, the forces of the coalition are not far behind. They will be in the region soon, and we cannot afford to be caught between the Royalists and their allies." Napoleon's gaze shifted to meet Bertrand's, his eyes sharp as ever. "We will deal with them when the time comes. Paris is the key. If we can secure the capital, the rest of France will fall into line. The Royalists will have no choice but to surrender." The generals exchanged wary glances, but none spoke. They knew that arguing with Napoleon was pointless once he had made a decision. His brilliance on the battlefield was undeniable, and even in the face of overwhelming odds, he had always found a way to emerge victorious. The men knew they were following a leader who would not accept failure, who would not rest until his empire was restored. The march began almost immediately. The soldiers, though exhausted from the previous battles, fell into their ranks with the precision that Napoleon demanded. The thought of Paris, of the capital that had once been the heart of his empire, stirred something deep within them. The men had fought hard for this moment, and they would fight even harder for what lay ahead. As they moved through the night, the sound of their boots hitting the ground was like the rhythm of war itself. The moon hung high above, casting an eerie light on the road ahead. The journey toward Paris was long, but every step was one closer to victory. The army marched in perfect formation, their movements seamless, their purpose clear. Napoleon rode at the head of his army, his mind focused on the road ahead. Paris was only a few days' march away, and he could already picture the streets of the city filled with the people who had once celebrated his reign. He could almost hear the cheers, the shouts of triumph, as he rode down the Champs-Élysées. But it would not be that simple. The Royalists were entrenched in the city, and the Royalist forces outside Paris would make their final stand. There was no room for error. As they neared Paris, Napoleon's thoughts turned to the broader picture. He had been exiled once, and now, he was returning to reclaim what was rightfully his. The French people had rejected the monarchy, and the monarchy had rejected them. Napoleon had offered stability, order, and a vision for the future. The people of France had trusted him, and they would again. But he knew that to secure that future, he would have to defeat the Royalists and their allies once and for all. As dawn broke over the horizon, the silhouette of Paris became visible in the distance. The city loomed large, its walls standing as a reminder of the resistance that awaited him. Napoleon's army was close, but so were the enemy forces. It was no longer just a battle for territory, it was a battle for the soul of France. If he could take Paris, he would once again be emperor, and the coalitions could be beaten back. But if he failed, it would mean the end of his dreams, the end of his empire, and perhaps the end of France as he had known it. Napoleon halted his horse, his eyes fixed on the city ahead. It was time. The final battle was near. And Napoleon knew that it would be a battle to the death. He turned to his generals, his voice low but resolute. "This is it. Paris is our final obstacle. We take the city, and the empire is restored. We will show the world that nothing can stand in the way of France. Forward to Paris!" The army surged forward once more, the weight of history upon their shoulders. Napoleon led them, not just as a conqueror, but as a man on a mission to restore the glory of France. Paris awaited, and with it, his destiny. The morning sky over Paris was a pale gray, the first light of dawn illuminating the French capital with a muted glow. From a distance, Napoleon's army approached, marching steadily forward, a vast column of soldiers stretching across the rolling hills that led to the city. The iconic silhouette of the Bastille stood tall, a symbol of the Revolution and a past that had shaped the city forever. Paris, for all its history, now faced the same crossroads it had once faced during the rise of the Revolution. Napoleon was returning not only to reclaim the throne, but to decide once and for all the future of France. Napoleon sat atop his horse, his eyes fixed on the distant city. There was no emotion in his gaze, just an unwavering focus, a steely resolve. The battle was inevitable. The confrontation with the Royalists, with the forces of the coalition, had been coming for weeks, but the finality of it all seemed to hang in the air. The capital loomed ahead, and with it, the answer to everything, the success or failure of his return to power. His generals surrounded him, all riding with purpose, their faces serious. General Bertrand, ever the calm presence, spoke first. "Sire, Paris is well defended. The Royalists inside the city are preparing for a prolonged siege. The walls are fortified, and their garrisons are entrenched. They have been waiting for our arrival." Napoleon gave a nod, his expression unchanging. "They are fortified, yes. But they are not ready for us. We will strike fast, and we will strike with everything we have. We will give them no time to prepare." General Drouet, Napoleon's chief artillery officer, chimed in. "We have heavy artillery with us, sire. We will bombard the city's defenses from the outskirts. But we need to act quickly before the coalition forces arrive. Time is against us." Napoleon glanced at Drouet, his sharp eyes calculating. "We have time enough," he said coolly. "They underestimate us. They believe we will be bogged down, that we are weak. But we will show them how wrong they are." The army continued its march, growing nearer to the outskirts of the city. Napoleon's mind raced with plans, strategies, and contingencies. Paris, as the center of France's political power, was key to everything. If he could take the city, it would be a powerful symbol, not only to France but to the world. It would signify that his return had been no illusion, that he was once again the emperor. His reputation, which had been shattered by his exile, would be restored. and the monarchists would have no ground left to stand on. But the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Paris, with its historic defenses and strategic significance, would not fall easily. The city was a fortress, a center of culture and power. The royalists inside would fight to the bitter end, and the coalition forces were closing in from the north, ready to support the city's defenses. Napoleon knew that if he did not move quickly, the momentum would slip from his hands. As the French forces neared the outer barricades of the city, the air grew tense. The streets of Paris, once vibrant and bustling with life, now felt empty, almost ominous. The distant hum of movement within the city reached their ears, but there were no signs of large-scale activity. The royalists were waiting, biding their time. Napoleon knew they would not make the first move. They would wait for his forces to arrive, and then they would strike when they thought the moment was right. Napoleon signaled for his generals to gather around him. "We will move with precision. The coalition forces are still several days away. We cannot wait for them to arrive. The time to strike is now." He outlined the plan in clear, concise terms. The artillery would begin the bombardment of the northern defenses, using the city's own fortifications against the royalists. As the royalists concentrated on defending the northern front, Napoleon's infantry would move in from the south, using the river Seine as cover for their advance. The cavalry would flank from the west, cutting off any escape or reinforcement from the countryside. With the plan in place, the artillery began to rumble into action, its thunderous roars breaking the stillness of the early morning. The first barrage struck the northern defenses of the city, shaking the walls with the force of the cannons. The royalists inside the city scrambled to respond, their own artillery returning fire, but the French army was too well prepared. Napoleon had anticipated this, knowing that the element of surprise would be key. As the bombardment continued, Napoleon's infantry moved in, crossing the river under the cover of darkness. The first wave was quick, disciplined, and efficient. They advanced toward the south gate of the city, their formation unyielding, the rhythm of their march echoing through the streets. Napoleon's men were resolute, having tasted victory in Lyon and now eager to take the capital that had once crowned him emperor. Inside Paris, the royalists' confusion was palpable. They had expected a longer siege, a prolonged conflict in which they could dig in and wear down Napoleon's forces. But instead they were faced with an all-out assault that struck faster than they could prepare for. The defenders at the northern walls were already under heavy fire from Napoleon's artillery, and soon they would be unable to hold the line. The first skirmishes broke out in the narrow streets near the southern gates, where Napoleon's forces encountered stiff resistance from royalist militias. The battle was brutal, street by street, building by building. Napoleon's forces had the advantage in numbers, but the royalists fought with desperation, knowing that if they lost Paris, they lost everything. Napoleon's cavalry, once they had flanked around the western edge of the city, moved quickly into position. Their arrival disrupted the royalist lines of communication, cutting off any potential reinforcements, and trapping the defenders within the walls of the city. The French army, bolstered by its cavalry, was now closing in from all directions, and the royalists were encircled. Napoleon moved with his generals, overseeing the operation from the front lines. His horse was steady beneath him, and he rode with calm authority. There was no panic in his movements, no haste. Every decision was measured, calculated. He knew that victory was within his grasp, but he could not afford to become overconfident. The city was a labyrinth of streets and defenses, and each corner held the potential for resistance. The royalists began to crack. Their commanders, confused by the speed and precision of Napoleon's advance, struggled to coordinate their defenses. The forces inside Paris, already stretched thin, could not hold the line. Napoleon's infantry pressed forward with relentless force, slowly breaking the will of the defenders. The streets that had been so full of life only days before were now filled with the chaos of war. The smoke of battle still hung in the air as Paris slowly came to life after the storm of Napoleon's return. The grand boulevards that had once witnessed the splendor of his reign were now scarred by the evidence of the battle that had raged within their walls. The rumble of distant cannons had ceased, but the echoes of the conflict still reverberated in the hearts of the people. The city, though captured, bore the marks of a fight that would be remembered for generations. Napoleon stood in the courtyard of the Tuileries Palace, the seat of his former empire, his mind focused on the task at hand. The massive gates had been flung open, the remnants of the royalist defenses lay scattered around the city, and the cries of victory echoed through the streets. But despite the triumph, there was no time for celebration. The coalition armies, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain, were still out there, still organizing their forces, still determined to take back what had been lost. A steady stream of officers and advisors filtered into the palace courtyard, each with reports of the latest developments. Napoleon's expression remained unchanged, a mask of discipline and authority, as he listened to each one, absorbing the information with the cold precision that had come to define him. General Bertrand, his loyal ally, was the first to approach, a map of Paris in hand. He bowed his head slightly before speaking. "Sire, we have taken the city, but the royalists within Paris are not yet fully broken. Many are still regrouping in the catacombs and the churches. The remnants of the royalist army outside the city have begun to retreat, but they are not defeated. They are heading north, toward the coalition forces. It is only a matter of time before they link up and form a new front." Napoleon nodded, his gaze scanning the map that Bertrand had unfurled before him. The route to the north was clear, but it was not unguarded. The coalition forces were closing in, and every minute he spent in Paris allowed them to reinforce their position. His mind raced through the options, weighing each one with the precision of a seasoned strategist. The city was his, but the war was far from over. He had to act quickly. "Send word to the army," Napoleon commanded, his voice cutting through the tension of the moment. "We move at once. The royalists are broken, but their remnants will regroup if given time. We must strike before they can reinforce their position. We cannot afford to wait." Bertrand nodded and quickly relayed the orders to his subordinates. As the general hurried off, Napoleon stood still for a moment longer, looking out across the city. The Tuileries, the symbol of his empire, felt eerily silent now. The grand halls that had once hosted diplomatic gatherings and lavish celebrations stood empty, the walls echoing only with the faint sounds of the ongoing military action outside. The palace was a reminder of everything he had built, and everything he was now fighting to protect. Napoleon's attention was broken by the arrival of Marshal Ney, the Duke of Elchingen, who had been one of his most trusted commanders. Ney saluted sharply before speaking. "Sire, the royalists are disorganized. Their forces are scattering in all directions. However, we have reports of enemy cavalry moving toward the city. The coalition armies will likely attempt to join forces with the royalists in the coming days. We must prepare for another clash." Napoleon's eyes narrowed. The situation was becoming more complicated than he had anticipated. A united coalition army would be a formidable opponent, but he had no intention of allowing them to consolidate their forces. He had already faced these coalitions before, he had crushed them once, and he would do it again. The challenge now was to move quickly, to use the momentum from his victory in Paris to keep the enemy from regrouping. "We'll take the initiative," Napoleon said with quiet certainty. "We'll head north, strike hard at the coalition's weaker flanks, and break their unity. We will make it clear that France is not a land to be conquered. We will destroy them piecemeal, one battle at a time." Ney raised an eyebrow. "Sire, the northern front is heavily fortified. The coalition has a strong presence there. Even with our forces, an assault would be costly." Napoleon met his marshal's gaze unshaken. "They expect us to retreat into Paris and wait for reinforcements. Let them think that. We will take the fight to them. The element of surprise is ours." The air grew still for a moment as the weight of the plan settled in. Napoleon's confidence was infectious. Marshal Ney, despite his reservations, knew that when Napoleon set his mind to something, failure was not an option. The army would follow, as they always had, with unwavering loyalty. "Very well, sire," Ney said, saluting once more. "We will prepare for the march north." Napoleon turned to his officers, who had gathered around him in silent anticipation. The moment of victory in Paris had passed, and now they stood on the precipice of a new chapter, one that would determine the future of the empire. The battle for France was far from over, but Napoleon's resolve was clear. His empire would not fall without one last, decisive effort. The soldiers around him knew this battle would be like the others, brutal, relentless, and unforgiving. "We move out in the morning," Napoleon declared, his voice filled with quiet authority. "We will drive the coalition forces back. They have underestimated us, and they will learn that the might of France is not so easily broken. No army can stand against us when we strike with unity and purpose." The officers nodded, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and respect. Napoleon had given them purpose, and they would follow him, as they always had. The reputation of the emperor was legendary, and even those who had once doubted him now followed his every command with unquestioning loyalty. As the officers departed to begin preparations, Napoleon remained in the courtyard, his thoughts momentarily drifting back to the battlefield. The image of the coalition forces gathering in the north loomed large in his mind. He could not afford to underestimate them, but neither could they underestimate him. His return to power had been swift, but the war was about to enter its most perilous stage. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, who had been appointed King of Spain by Napoleon during the height of his empire. Joseph bowed as he approached Napoleon, but his expression was concerned. "Sire," Joseph began, his voice laced with worry, "there are reports that Spain is in turmoil. The remnants of the British and Spanish forces are still operating in the Iberian Peninsula, and unrest is growing. I fear that if we do not act quickly, the coalition may gain further support." Napoleon's gaze hardened. The situation in Spain was a complication he had not anticipated, but it was one he could not ignore. If the British and Spanish forces continued to destabilize the region, it would give the coalition even more strength. But for now, his focus was on the north. He could not afford to be stretched thin. "Spain is a problem we will address later," Napoleon said firmly. "For now, our focus is on Paris, and then we march north. If Spain becomes a threat, I will handle it in due time. But first, we must secure France." The chill of dawn settled over the French countryside as Napoleon's army prepared for its march north. Paris, still reeling from the intensity of its capture, now lay under the weight of the emperor's determination. The streets that had witnessed the clash between the royalists and Napoleon's forces were silent, the only sounds being the clattering of hooves and the whispered orders of officers as they rallied their men. The city had been secured, but the war, far from finished, loomed on the horizon. Napoleon stood at the front of his headquarters, overlooking the preparations. His soldiers, weathered by the intensity of their campaigns, moved with practiced precision, their discipline a reflection of their leader's will. They knew the stakes were high. They knew that this campaign, this battle, could shape the fate of France for generations. As the final cavalry squadrons readied themselves and the infantry formed their ranks, the sounds of war, horses whinnying, soldiers murmuring, artillery wagons creaking, began to fill the morning air. Yet in the heart of the camp, there was a tense, almost reverential quiet. Napoleon's gaze was fixed, unblinking, on the northern horizon. His mind was already ahead, envisioning the moves to come, the battle that awaited them. A steady stream of his generals arrived at his side. Marshal Ney, still bearing the look of a man who had fought at the very gates of the city, approached first. His face was set, eyes narrowed against the wind, but there was a spark of eagerness in his voice. "Sire, our scouts report that the coalition forces are indeed assembling to the north, and their cavalry has begun to move. They have begun forming defensive positions, but they are spread thin. The opportunity to strike quickly and decisively is ours." Napoleon nodded, eyes still fixed on the distant horizon. "We cannot let them consolidate. They think they are safe behind their defenses, but they are not. We will hit them where they are weakest. We will strike hard and fast, as we always have." Marshal Davout, known for his brutal efficiency in battle, stepped forward. His voice was calm, but there was a palpable intensity behind it. "Sire, I suggest we hit them from the east. Their forces are concentrated in the west, but their right flank is vulnerable. With our artillery and cavalry in the lead, we can outmaneuver them before they have the chance to regroup. Napoleon turned his attention to Davout. The marshal's strategic acumen was unparalleled, and Napoleon trusted his judgment implicitly. Agreed. We will attack their right flank, but we will keep our cavalry in reserve. I want them ready to exploit any weakness in their lines once we strike. We will create chaos, and in the confusion, we will break them. The generals nodded in unison, the plan now set in motion. As the troops began to assemble and the first rays of the sun illuminated the field, the army marched out from the gates of Paris, leaving the capital behind. The sound of marching feet and the rhythmic clatter of the wagons created a steady beat, like the pulse of a heart, as the emperor's forces moved with purpose toward the battle that awaited them. Napoleon rode at the head of his army, his dark uniform a stark contrast against the pale light of morning. He was silent, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and contingencies, but his expression was firm. There was no room for doubt. There was no hesitation. This was the moment he had been preparing for, this was where his genius would be tested. As they advanced toward the northern region, the terrain began to change. The flat, open plains gave way to dense forests and low hills. Napoleon's men moved in perfect formation, with artillery and infantry units marching side by side, and cavalry riding in loose formation, ready to be called upon at a moment's notice. The air was thick with anticipation as the army neared the first position of the coalition forces. Napoleon's scouts had reported that the enemy had dug in along a series of ridgelines to the north, preparing for a siege. Their lines were tight, their fortifications well positioned. But Napoleon knew that speed and surprise would give his army the upper hand. He would not give them the chance to dig in further. As the army advanced, the first signs of the enemy appeared on the horizon. The coalition had set up camp on a series of ridgelines overlooking the plain, their cavalry moving in reconnaissance, and their infantry dug into defensive positions. From a distance, they seemed formidable, well prepared, but Napoleon saw an opening. The defensive lines were too focused on the western approach. Their right flank was weak, vulnerable to a swift strike. Napoleon signaled for his generals to assemble. He reviewed the position once more with them, his mind working through each potential move, each countermove, each decision that could mean victory or defeat. "We will hit them before they are ready," Napoleon said, his voice low but filled with authority. "I want their right flank in disarray before they can react. Drought, have the artillery ready. We will soften their defenses before we make our move." General Drought, ever reliable, nodded. He moved quickly to marshal the artillery units, the sound of heavy cannons being wheeled into position echoing through the camp. Napoleon turned back to his officers. "Marshal Ney, I need your cavalry to circle to the east. Your men will strike at their right flank, catch them by surprise, and break their line. The infantry will follow closely behind to press the attack." Ney saluted, his face a picture of determination. "It shall be done, sire." Napoleon watched as the first cavalry units began to move out, their hooves kicking up clouds of dust as they fanned out across the field. The infantry units began to form up as well, their movements synchronized in perfect order. The stage was set. The first cannon fire rang out as the artillery began its bombardment. The heavy cannons roared, sending shells streaking across the battlefield toward the enemy's defensive lines. Smoke billowed into the air as the earth trembled beneath the impact. The coalition forces were forced to adjust, their attention diverted toward the source of the bombardment. It was precisely the distraction Napoleon had intended. From the east, Ney's cavalry struck. They charged in a sweeping arc, their sabers gleaming in the sunlight as they cut through the thin defenses of the coalition right flank. The enemy cavalry, unprepared for such a ferocious attack, scattered in disarray. Napoleon's forces pressed forward, following the cavalry's charge with infantry moving in, marching forward in perfect unison. The coalition forces, stunned by the rapid strike, struggled to reorganize. Napoleon's infantry arrived swiftly, filling the gaps in the coalition defenses, pushing forward with relentless precision. The field was filled with the sound of battle, the clash of swords, the crackle of musket fire, the roar of artillery. The chaos was palpable, but amid it, Napoleon's men moved with the discipline and unity that had won them so many victories. Napoleon remained at the center of the action, his eyes constantly scanning the battlefield. His presence on the field, though not always visible, was felt by every soldier. His mind worked in tandem with his army, guiding them with the same efficiency that had led him through countless campaigns. The echo of retreating cannon fire reverberated across the battlefield as Napoleon's army pressed onward. The winds carried the acrid scent of smoke and the scent of the earth, churned into mud by the weight of thousands of boots and the thunderous passage of war machines. The victorious French soldiers moved with the kind of purposeful precision that only Napoleon's command could inspire. Behind them, the battlefield stretched wide and barren, a testament to the ferocity of the clash they had just won. The remnants of the coalition army lay scattered across the field, broken and disarrayed, their lines utterly shattered. Napoleon, though victorious, could not afford to bask in the triumph for long. His mind was already shifting toward the next step. He stood atop a slight rise, his gaze fixed on the horizon where, far off, the coalition forces were retreating in a disorganized flight. The French had won the day, but it was not enough. Not yet. His generals gathered around him, their faces etched with weariness, but their spirits buoyed by the Emperor's relentless drive. Marshal Ney, ever loyal, approached first. His face was a mix of satisfaction and readiness, his uniform streaked with dust and battle stains, yet his eyes remained sharp, focused. "Sire, the enemy is in full retreat. Their cavalry is scattered, and their infantry is fleeing in disarray. We have them on the run, but I believe we should press on immediately, before they can regroup." Napoleon turned his head slightly to look at Ney, a thin, calculating smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The marshal had a tendency to act swiftly, and his instincts were often spot on. Napoleon had no doubt that the enemy was vulnerable, but he also understood the nature of these wars. The coalition armies were not easily crushed in one fell swoop. The retreat was part of their strategy, a controlled withdrawal to their fortified positions. "They may be in retreat, Marshal," Napoleon replied, his voice steady, "but we must not chase them blindly. We know their retreat is not without purpose. They will attempt to regroup at their defensive lines, most likely behind the rivers and ridgelines to the north. We will not make the mistake of overextending our forces. We will follow, but we will be cautious. Let them think they've escaped, and we'll strike when they least expect it." Ney nodded, though his desire to press the advantage was clear. He had seen the potential for a swift follow-up that could decimate the enemy's already fragile morale. Napoleon, however, was ever the strategist, and his calculation was always to play the long game. General Drouet, the commander of Napoleon's artillery, spoke next, his voice calm, but firm. "Sire, our artillery has done excellent work today. We've torn holes in their defenses, and many of their positions are now unguarded. If we push on now, we could break through before they reinforce their lines. It's a rare opportunity." Napoleon met his general's gaze, his thoughts swirling with the possibilities. The idea of breaking through the enemy's defenses while they were still in disarray had a certain appeal, but he knew that one mistake could lead to costly losses. The coalition forces had regrouped before, they would do so again. "I understand, General. But we cannot afford to be reckless. We have the advantage, yes, but we must keep our forces together. A divided army is a vulnerable one." Napoleon's voice was calm but resolute. "We will continue to follow them, but with caution. The moment they make a stand is the moment we strike. I want your artillery ready to fire as soon as we have a clear shot." Drouet nodded and turned to organize his men, confident in the Emperor's wisdom. Napoleon turned his attention back to the battlefield, watching as his men moved forward, their steps methodical, unhurried. The day's victory was a solid one, but the battle for the future of France had only just begun. The coalition would not give up without a fight, and Napoleon knew that no victory was permanent without the resolve to ensure it. The column began its slow, disciplined march northward, the soldiers in perfect formation, their spirits lifted by the success of the previous day. The artillery wagons rumbled in their wake, the sound of their heavy wheels a constant reminder of the power they wielded. Behind them, the wounded and the dead remained on the field, awaiting the grim task of being counted and cared for. As the army advanced, Napoleon fell into his familiar rhythm of observation. His eyes were ever watchful, taking in every detail, the shifting of enemy lines, the distance between them, the terrain that would either help or hinder their march. The French soldiers marched on with grim determination. They had fought hard, and now they had to make their victory count. Napoleon's thoughts turned to the coalition. Though the battle had been a decisive victory, it had not been without cost. He could not afford to underestimate the enemy. Their armies were vast, their resolve unbroken. If he was to succeed in his campaign and reclaim the empire, he would need more than just victories. He would need to maintain the momentum, to outmaneuver the coalition at every turn. The landscape around him began to change as they marched through the rolling hills, the horizon dotted with the shadows of trees and distant farmhouses. A cold wind swept across the field, sending ripples of dust through the air. The ground beneath their feet had been soft and muddy after the battle, but now it was firm, hard beneath the weight of thousands of soldiers. The army's march was steady, disciplined, but even the most seasoned of warriors could sense the tension in the air, the calm before another storm. Napoleon halted his horse atop a small ridge, his generals forming around him as the army came to a pause behind them. In the distance, they could see the remnants of the coalition forces beginning to reorganize. The smoke of battle still hung thick in the air, but the enemy's retreat had slowed as they neared their fortified positions. "They are making their stand," Napoleon said softly, almost to himself. He had been expecting it. The coalition had retreated for the moment, but now they were preparing to fight once more. This was it, the decisive moment. "We will break their lines here. This is where we win the war." Ney, eager as ever, spoke with a determination that mirrored his leader's. "Sire, we've pushed them to the brink. A swift, concentrated assault will do the job." Napoleon nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, but this time we will do it methodically. No rash attacks. We will use their own momentum against them." Marshal Davout, the silent tactician, stepped forward. "Sire, we could hit them from multiple fronts. If we deploy our forces along their left and right flanks, we can push them inward, trapping them between our lines and their own defensive positions." The sun hung low on the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. The air was thick with tension, the very earth beneath Napoleon's boots seeming to hum with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. His army, though battle-worn and weary from the previous day's relentless march, had gathered its strength for this moment. They were ready, as always, to follow their emperor into the heart of battle. Napoleon sat astride his steed, a silhouette against the smoke-filled sky. His generals were assembled around him, awaiting his orders. The faint sound of distant artillery fire drifted in the air, a reminder of the violence that had preceded this moment, and a signal that the coalition forces were preparing their own defenses. The tension in the air was palpable. Napoleon had led them to victory time and again, but this time the stakes were higher than ever. Today would not just be a battle, it would be a reckoning. Marshal Ney, his ever-loyal ally, stepped forward, his face serious but resolute. "Sire, the enemy is preparing for a stand. Their defensive positions are strong, but not unbreakable. We have them cornered. If we strike now, we can crush them before they regroup fully." Napoleon turned his gaze to Ney, his expression unreadable. He trusted the marshal, perhaps more than any other. Ney's instincts in battle had never failed him, but Napoleon knew that rashness could be as dangerous as hesitation. The stakes were high today, and Napoleon was aware of the risks. "We strike," Napoleon replied, his voice calm but filled with authority. "But we will not rush in blindly. They know we're coming. Let's not give them the luxury of thinking we'll make the same mistakes twice. We will hit them from both sides, force them into the center, and close in like a vice." Ney nodded, turning to rally his cavalry, while General Drouet moved to position the artillery for the coming assault. Napoleon's mind, as always, was 2 steps ahead. He had learned to anticipate the moves of his enemies before they even made them. He knew that his army's discipline and cohesion would be the deciding factor. But he also knew that the coalition forces, though battered, were still formidable. Their retreat had been tactical, not a sign of weakness. They had regrouped, fortified their positions, and now they stood ready to meet him in the field. The sound of marching feet filled the air as Napoleon's forces began their advance. The infantry moved in perfect formation, their lines long and unbroken. Behind them, the artillery began to rumble into position, their cannons towering over the men as they took their places along the ridgelines. In the distance, the coalition's defensive fortifications became clearer, a series of ridges and ditches, with troops entrenched in well-organized lines. Napoleon could see the enemy's movements, their preparations. They were ready, but their positioning was flawed. The right flank was strong, but their left was exposed. Napoleon saw an opportunity. If he could exploit that weakness, he could break their formation and force a retreat. His mind worked quickly, calculating the best approach. The cavalry would strike at the enemy's left flank, where the defenses were weakest. The infantry would press forward to create a diversion, drawing the attention of the enemy's center, while the artillery prepared to soften up the right. This would be their moment. Napoleon turned to his commanders. "Marshal Ney, your cavalry will engage on the left. Keep their attention there while Davout's infantry pushes forward. We'll use the artillery to break their center. Once their lines are disrupted, we press the attack from both flanks." Ney saluted, eager to carry out the order. Napoleon knew the marshal was always at his best in such moments, when the battle was fast-paced, when decisive action could turn the tide. Napoleon trusted him to execute the plan with precision. Drouet, the ever-steady artillery commander, gave a nod of understanding. "Sire, our guns are in position. We are ready to unleash hell on their center." Napoleon's eyes narrowed, his thoughts already racing through the next phase of the plan. "We wait for the signal. Once the first volley is fired, we move. No hesitation." The wind carried the scent of gunpowder as the artillery positions began to fire. The first volley thundered across the field, the sound of it deafening. The earth shook beneath the force of the impact, and clouds of smoke erupted from the enemy's positions as their defenses were rocked by the force of Napoleon's guns. The coalition forces had barely enough time to react before Napoleon's infantry surged forward, following the artillery's bombardment with unrelenting speed. The cavalry, under Ney's command, charged the left flank with ferocious energy. The sight of French cavalry thundering across the field, their sabers raised, sent a ripple of panic through the enemy ranks. Ney's men were swift, their horses cutting through the enemy's disorganized defenses with precision. The coalition's left flank began to crumble under the weight of the assault, their soldiers fleeing in disarray. As the enemy's attention shifted to their left, the French infantry pressed forward, their disciplined march a counterpoint to the chaos on the right. Napoleon's forces moved like a machine, each unit performing its role with terrifying efficiency. The coalition's defensive lines began to waver, and that was all Napoleon needed. The artillery, positioned to target the heart of the coalition's defenses, continued its bombardment, the sound of cannon fire almost continuous. Every shot that landed added to the pressure. The coalition's center buckled, their lines fracturing under the sustained onslaught. Napoleon watched as the enemy began to fall back, their once proud defensive positions collapsing. But the coalition was not defeated yet. As the French forces pushed forward, Napoleon could see the enemy regrouping, pulling back to their final strongholds. The fighting was far from over. The battlefield was shifting from one of open assault to one of tight, brutal close combat. Napoleon's cavalry, having routed the left flank, circled around to trap the retreating enemy in a vice. Ney's men pushed forward with relentless force, closing in on the coalition's exposed right side. As the infantry advanced, the enemy's once formidable position began to crumble, their retreat turning into a rout. Napoleon's mind raced as he observed the battlefield. This was it. The moment of victory was within his grasp, but there was no time to waste. He turned to Marshal Davout, who had been coordinating the infantry's advance. "Push harder, Davout," Napoleon commanded. "Force them to the center. Do not allow them to escape." Davout nodded, his face determined. The infantry moved like a hammer, crushing what was left of the coalition's lines, forcing the enemy into a tight pocket. The artillery continued to rain destruction on their defenses, and the cavalry closed in from all sides. In the distance, Napoleon could see the coalition forces beginning to retreat in earnest. Their morale had shattered under the combined onslaught of French artillery, infantry, and cavalry. The shattered remnants of their once proud formation now looked like a disorganized mob, desperately attempting to flee the battlefield. Napoleon's eyes were alight with determination. This was the final push, the moment where everything would come together. The coalition had no more reserves, no more options. They had lost the initiative, and now the French were poised to claim victory. As the battle neared its conclusion, the sounds of combat began to fade, replaced by the desperate cries of the retreating soldiers. The French army was relentless, pressing forward, their movements like a storm that could not be stopped. The coalition forces, disordered and demoralized, were breaking, their lines disintegrating before the might of Napoleon's forces. Napoleon watched the scene unfold before him, his heart pounding with the rhythm of the battlefield. He knew that this battle would be remembered as one of his finest moments. The precision of his plan, the discipline of his soldiers, and the tireless determination of his generals had come together in a symphony of war. The enemy had been broken. As the French army surged across the battlefield, chasing down the remnants of the coalition forces, Napoleon allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was what he did best. He had anticipated their moves, outsmarted them, and destroyed their defenses with the devastating precision of a master tactician. But even as the battlefield began to settle into silence, Napoleon's mind was already turning to the next challenge. The war was not yet over. There would be more battles, more decisions to be made. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for now, Napoleon knew one thing with absolute certainty: he had once again proven his greatness on the field of battle. The coalition had been defeated here, but Napoleon's empire was far from complete. The world would soon feel the weight of his victories, and his name would echo through history, as he continued to shape the destiny of Europe. As the last echoes of cannon fire faded into the horizon, the battlefield fell into an eerie stillness, broken only by the sounds of men moving across the blood-soaked earth. The once vibrant fields, now scarred by the destruction of war, were littered with the fallen, soldiers who had fought valiantly for their causes, now left to be gathered by the grim task of those who followed. Napoleon's army had triumphed once again, but the cost of victory was steep. Napoleon sat atop his steed, his gaze sweeping across the field, surveying the aftermath of the conflict. His eyes, sharp as ever, took in the sight of the retreating coalition forces, their broken formations scattering into the distance. He could already see the faint outlines of their remaining leaders, organizing the survivors for a withdrawal that would mark the beginning of their defeat. The battle had been decisive, but the war was far from over. It was a bitter victory, not one of unbridled celebration, but of hard-fought triumph. "Victory is ours, sire," said Marshal Ney, his voice steady, but wearied from the day's brutal engagements. His uniform was a mess of dirt and blood, his face etched with the lines of exhaustion. Despite his fatigue, there was a look of relief in his eyes. They had won, but it had been a costly win, and Ney knew it would take time to recover from the losses they had sustained. Napoleon nodded, his expression somber. His gaze lingered on the bodies of both his men and the coalition forces, now scattered across the ground like discarded debris. The sight of it always weighed heavily on him, even as he knew that this was the price of war. "I know, Marshal," Napoleon replied, his voice cool, his tone pensive. "But it is not enough. They are broken, yes, but they are not finished. Their commanders will regroup, they will fortify new lines, and we will be forced to face them again." His mind was already turning to the future, to the strategic decisions that would need to be made. He was a man of action, always thinking several steps ahead, and the road to total victory was not yet clear. Napoleon turned to face his generals, all of whom stood with him, their faces tired but resolute. "We've won the battle," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "But we must not rest. We need to keep the pressure on them, press them further back, and secure our position before they can regroup. Of course, sire, Marshal Davout responded, stepping forward. His demeanor was calm, a sharp contrast to the energy of the battle. He had always been a master of logistics and organization, his mind focused on the practical steps needed to ensure victory. We will pursue them immediately, prevent them from establishing any more strongholds. Napoleon's eyes darkened slightly as he regarded his trusted marshal. Good. Make sure we have sufficient supplies for the pursuit. I will not have our forces bogged down. We must move quickly and decisively. Davout bowed, his gaze unwavering. As you command, sire. We will move out as soon as possible. Napoleon turned his attention back to the battlefield, his gaze narrowing. He could already hear the distant sounds of the coalition's retreat. Though their lines had shattered, they were not completely broken. He could see the remnants of their army forming up in the distance, retreating into the forests and hills that surrounded the plain. It would not be easy to finish them off. They would fight on, but Napoleon was confident. His army was victorious today, and the momentum would remain with him. Marshal Soult! Napoleon called, his eyes flickering to the general standing to his left. Soult stepped forward, his eyes meeting Napoleon's with respect and determination. I want you to lead a force to their rear. We need to catch them before they can dig in. Once we've taken their supply lines, they will have no choice but to retreat further. Soult nodded, understanding the task at hand. I will see to it immediately, sire. Napoleon's mind was already focused on the next step of the campaign. He would not give the coalition the time they needed to recover. This victory was important, but it was only a chapter in a much larger book of war, one that he was determined to write in his favor. With each passing day, the power of the French Empire grew, but so too did the strength of those who sought to undo him. As the generals dispersed to carry out their orders, Napoleon remained where he was, looking out over the battlefield. He could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. The lives of his men, the future of France, and the fate of Europe all depended on his next moves. He had won, but it was not a victory to savor. The cost was too great for that. His thoughts turned to the men under his command, those who had fought with him, bled with him, and who would follow him into whatever came next. Napoleon's heart swelled with pride for them, even as his mind raced ahead, planning for the next phase of the war. He would see this campaign through to its end, no matter the cost. The night was beginning to fall, and the winds carried the scent of the battlefield, the smell of victory mixed with the stench of death. Napoleon's mind was as sharp as ever, and the silence around him did nothing to dull his focus. He had known for years that the price of greatness was steep. He had always understood that the road to empire was paved with blood, and this battle was no different. Napoleon's gaze hardened as he turned to face his officers once again, his voice steady and commanding. We have done what we set out to do today. But this war is far from over. We will follow them, break their will, and crush their resistance. There is no turning back now. With those words, Napoleon spurred his horse forward, his officers falling in behind him. The French army, weary but unbroken, began its pursuit of the shattered coalition forces. The battle had been won, but the war, Napoleon knew, would continue until one side or the other was completely destroyed. As the army moved forward, the moon rose high in the sky, casting its pale light over the men who had fought and bled for this moment. Napoleon did not look back at the battlefield, though he could sense the weight of the victory lingering in the air. He had always known that victory was never certain, but today, as he rode with his generals at his side, he allowed himself one brief thought: they would win this war. He would see to it. The French Empire would rise higher, and Napoleon Bonaparte would secure his place in history. The world had not yet seen the full extent of his ambition, but they would soon. The battle had ended, but the war for Europe was just beginning, and Napoleon was ready to face whatever came next. The night was quiet, an unnatural calm after the chaos of battle. The French army, though triumphant, was weary. The ground was littered with the remnants of war, broken weapons, abandoned uniforms, and the bodies of the fallen. The wounded, both friend and foe, filled the makeshift medical tents, their groans and cries for help mingling with the distant sounds of retreating soldiers. In the midst of it all, Napoleon rode quietly through the camp, his mind heavy with thoughts of what had transpired and what was yet to come. His generals and staff were gathered around a large campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. There was no celebration in their eyes, only the grim satisfaction of a victory won. The men had fought hard, but Napoleon knew all too well that this was not the time for rest. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. Napoleon dismounted from his horse and approached the group. His silhouette was sharp and commanding in the flickering light of the fire. The men stood as one when they saw him, their expressions a mixture of respect and exhaustion. He was their leader, the man who had brought them to victory again and again, but even they could sense that the war was changing. The coalition forces had been severely weakened, but they were far from destroyed, and the possibility of more battles loomed on the horizon. "Gentlemen," Napoleon began, his voice low and authoritative, yet tinged with the weariness that had settled deep within him. "Today we won. But it is only one battle in a long war. I trust none of you believe that the enemy is finished. They will regroup, resupply, and fight again. And we will be ready." Marshal Davout, always the pragmatist, spoke first. His tone was matter-of-fact, yet there was an edge to his words. "We should press forward immediately, sire. The coalition forces are retreating, and if we strike now, we can catch them off guard before they regroup. Their morale is shattered. If we can break their remaining strength, the war could be over." Napoleon considered this, his gaze distant. He had already been thinking about the next phase. The army needed to keep moving, to maintain the momentum of their victory, but there was more at play than simply pursuing the enemy. "The retreating forces will try to find shelter in the mountains," Napoleon said, eyes narrowing. "If we push too hard, they will retreat into strongholds where we cannot follow. They may be weakened, but they are still capable of organizing a defense." He turned to Marshal Ney, who had been unusually quiet since the battle ended. Ney was a man of action, quick to engage, but today he seemed subdued, lost in his own thoughts. Napoleon studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Ney, what do you think?" he asked, his voice softening slightly. "You know the terrain better than anyone. Should we give chase, or should we prepare for the next phase?" Ney's eyes met Napoleon's, his face creased with exhaustion, but his mind sharp as ever. "We could pursue them, sire. But we must take care not to overextend. The coalition is broken, but they will seek refuge and reorganize. They will not simply surrender. If we give them time to rest, they may come back stronger. I suggest we follow them, but we also begin fortifying our position. We can't afford to be caught in the open." Napoleon nodded, appreciating the sound advice. Ney's instincts had often proven invaluable, and his caution now seemed warranted. "You're right," Napoleon said. "We will push forward, but we will do so cautiously. We cannot risk being drawn into a trap." Marshal Soult, who had been listening attentively, added his thoughts. "Sire, we've lost many men today. Our casualties are significant, and our supply lines are stretched thin. I would advise against any rash moves. A brief respite would allow us to reorganize and replenish our forces. The army needs time to recover." Napoleon paused, considering this. Soult's point was valid. The French army had fought hard, and though they had emerged victorious, the toll of the battle was evident. Men were wounded, supplies were low, and the risk of exhaustion could not be ignored. Napoleon turned to look at his generals, each of them seasoned warriors who had been through countless battles with him. He saw their determination, their loyalty, but also their fatigue. He understood the weight that rested on their shoulders, just as it rested on his. "No, we will not rest," he said firmly. "Not yet. We will keep the pressure on them, but we will do so strategically. I will send scouts to track the coalition's movements, and we will use their retreat to our advantage. We'll force them to fight for every inch of ground they claim." The men nodded in agreement, their faces a mixture of fatigue and resolve. Napoleon was their leader, and they trusted him, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. They had followed him through battles across Europe, and they would follow him now, no matter the cost. Napoleon turned and began to walk away, his thoughts already on the next move. He could feel the weight of the campaign bearing down on him. The war was far from over, but this victory had been a crucial step. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. The coalition forces, though battered, were not broken. Their leaders would find ways to regroup and replenish their strength. But Napoleon was not a man to let such things stand in his way. He would keep pushing forward, relentlessly, until the enemy was completely defeated. As he walked through the camp, the quiet murmurs of his officers faded behind him. He could feel the eyes of his men on him, and he knew they were watching for his next move. Napoleon had always been a man of action, a man who could turn the tide of history with a single decision. And he would do so again, for he knew that his destiny was far from fulfilled. He stood at the edge of the camp, looking out across the battlefield once more. The moonlight cast long shadows over the fallen, both French and enemy alike. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, blood, and the remnants of gunpowder. It was a scene of destruction, but also one of victory. For now, the battle was won. But Napoleon knew that the real test was still ahead. The coalition would not yield easily, and the wars would continue. The fate of Europe rested on his shoulders, and he could not afford to falter now. As he turned away from the scene, his resolve hardened. He would press on, and the world would feel the force of his will. The French Empire would rise to even greater heights, and Napoleon Bonaparte would carve his name into the annals of history. There would be no stopping him. The war was far from over, and Napoleon was ready. The dawn broke with an unsettling stillness. The sky, though clear, seemed to hang heavy over the battlefield, as though the very heavens were reluctant to witness what had transpired the day before. The French army, though victorious, was battered, its numbers diminished, and its spirit worn thin. The ground beneath their feet, once solid and firm, now felt unstable, as if it too mourned the lives lost. The cries of the wounded had faded overnight, but the haunting image of their suffering lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the carnage. Napoleon stood at the front of his command tent, gazing out over the encampment. His posture was as erect as ever, but his face was drawn with the weight of responsibility. Victory had been secured, yes, but it had come at a cost far greater than he would have liked to admit. He knew the war was not over, and the task that lay ahead of him was as monumental as any he had faced before. Even as the morning sun began to illuminate the camp, casting long shadows over the men, Napoleon's thoughts were already turned to the next phase of the campaign. His trusted generals gathered around him, their faces a mix of fatigue and weariness. They had been through much together, and though the victory had been hard-earned, they knew that more challenges awaited them. The coalition forces were not completely destroyed, and the remnants of their armies would likely regroup and attempt to strike back. This was a reality Napoleon could not ignore. Marshal Davout, as always, was the first to speak. "Sire, the enemy is retreating further into the interior. They've managed to keep some semblance of order, though their morale is shattered. If we move swiftly, we can continue to break their lines. But our men need rest, sire. They've fought long and hard." Napoleon's eyes narrowed as he listened. He appreciated the honesty of Davout's words, but he knew that time was not a luxury they could afford. "Rest will come, Marshal. But not yet. We cannot give them a chance to regroup. The longer we wait, the stronger they will become. We must push on." Davout nodded, though the strain of the past days was evident in his weary face. "Understood, sire." Napoleon turned to Marshal Ney, who had been quiet since the previous day. Ney was a man of action, and Napoleon could see that his usual fire had dimmed. Perhaps it was the weight of the battle that had taken its toll, or perhaps it was the realization of just how close the French had come to losing. The sight of so many fallen comrades, so many lost lives, had undoubtedly affected him. "Ney," Napoleon began, his voice softer than before. "What are your thoughts? Should we continue our pursuit?" Ney's gaze was far off, his mind clearly still processing the events of the previous day. But after a moment, he met Napoleon's eyes, his resolve hardening once again. "We have to keep going, sire. We've broken their front. If we stop now, we risk giving them the time they need to rally. But we also must be careful. The men are exhausted. If we press them too hard, we could risk a counterattack. We need to strike fast, but we must remain vigilant." Napoleon nodded thoughtfully, weighing his options. Ney was right to be cautious. The army had been through a great deal, and while their morale was still intact, the men were stretched thin. However, the pursuit of the retreating forces was paramount. If they could destroy the remnants of the coalition army before they could regroup, the war could be brought to a close far sooner than anyone anticipated. "I agree," Napoleon said after a moment. "We will push forward, but we will do so strategically. Marshal Soult, I want you to lead a division to scout their movements. Find their weak points, and exploit them. We will maintain pressure on their rear, but we will not engage unless we are certain of victory." Soult, ever the tactician, stepped forward. "As you command, sire. I will ensure that our scouts track their movements, and we will be ready to strike when the time is right." Napoleon's eyes flicked to the map spread out before him on the table. He could see the path of the enemy retreating further into the heart of Europe, but he also saw opportunities to cut them off, to seize their supplies, to push them into a corner from which there was no escape. This was a moment of great potential, but also one of great risk. A misstep could prove disastrous. "We will keep moving," Napoleon continued, his voice resolute. "The enemy is in disarray, but we cannot afford to be complacent. The longer we wait, the more time they will have to recover. We will press on, but we will be prepared for any contingencies." The generals nodded, each of them understanding the gravity of Napoleon's words. They had seen the cost of victory, their men had paid dearly for it. But they also knew that Napoleon was right. The war was far from over, and every day they hesitated was a day that the enemy could use to rebuild their strength. As the officers dispersed to carry out their orders, Napoleon stood alone for a moment, his mind still racing with plans and contingencies. The burden of command had always been heavy on his shoulders, but now it seemed even more so. Every decision he made, every move he ordered, could mean the difference between victory and defeat. And as he looked out over the camp, he could see the men preparing for the next leg of the journey, the next fight that awaited them. The sun had risen higher, casting a golden glow over the landscape. But beneath that warmth, the air was thick with tension. The French army was ready to move, ready to continue the pursuit of the shattered coalition forces. But there was no joy in the preparation. There was only the cold, hard realization that the war was not yet won, and that the path to true victory would be long and fraught with challenges. Napoleon mounted his horse and rode to the front of the camp, his generals falling in behind him. He could feel the eyes of his soldiers upon him as he passed, their faces weary but determined. They had followed him into battle, and now they would follow him again. They knew that this war was not just about territorial conquest, it was about survival. The fate of France rested on their shoulders, and Napoleon would not let them fail. As they began their march, Napoleon's mind was already focused on the enemy. The coalition forces had been broken, yes, but they had not been destroyed. They would regroup, and when they did, they would be a formidable foe. But Napoleon had faced down great challenges before, and he would do so again. He spurred his horse forward, leading his army into the unknown, the weight of destiny heavy upon him. The war was far from over, but Napoleon was ready. And as long as there was breath in his body, he would fight until the very end. The pursuit had begun once again. The battle for Europe continued, and Napoleon Bonaparte would not stop until his vision of victory had been realized. The morning fog clung to the earth like a shroud, the rising sun barely piercing the heavy mist. Napoleon stood at the edge of the camp, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground as he surveyed the landscape before him. The chill of the early morning air cut through his coat, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were far away, consumed with the endless calculations that came with war. Victory was always elusive, even in the midst of success. His army was exhausted, their morale tested by the brutal battles of the past weeks. Yet the pursuit of the retreating coalition forces was unyielding. Today would be another day of marching, another day of relentless pressure on the enemy. Napoleon knew that this was not the time for rest. Not yet. The coalition had been pushed back, but they were still alive, still capable of regrouping and mounting a counteroffensive. He would not give them that chance. His generals gathered around him, their faces etched with the same weary determination. Marshal Davout, Marshal Ney, and Marshal Soult all stood in a line, their expressions solemn. The time for celebrations had passed. They had weathered the storm of battle, but now the real challenge lay in pushing the enemy to their breaking point. Every movement, every decision, would be crucial. Failure was not an option. "We are closing in," Napoleon said, his voice cutting through the silence. The men stood at attention, listening intently. "The coalition forces are retreating, but they are far from broken. We will press forward. We cannot afford to let them regroup. If we strike now, we can cripple them completely. They have no choice but to fall back, but we must make sure they can't regain their strength." Davout, ever the realist, stepped forward. "Sire, we must take care. The enemy is not completely disorganized. We have pushed them into retreat, but they are still formidable. If we pursue too quickly, we risk falling into a trap. They know the terrain ahead, and they could use it to their advantage." Napoleon regarded him for a moment, his eyes narrowing in thought. Davout was right. The terrain ahead would give the enemy a chance to fortify themselves, but if Napoleon hesitated for too long, the coalition forces would slip away, and the opportunity would be lost. His mind raced through the possibilities, each one carrying with it its own risks and rewards. "I understand your concern, Marshal," Napoleon replied, his voice steady. "But we cannot allow them the luxury of time. If they find a stronghold and regroup, we will face an even greater challenge. We must keep the pressure on. We cannot stop until they are defeated." Ney, his voice low but filled with conviction, added, "The army is tired, sire. We've marched for days without respite. The men are weary. Their spirits are still high, but I fear that if we continue without rest, their strength will be spent. We must not squander this victory by pushing them too hard." Napoleon turned to Ney, his eyes briefly flicking to the faces of the men who stood beside him. He could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the toll that battle had taken on each of them. He knew that the men needed rest, but he also knew that victory was fleeting. There would be no time for rest if the enemy regained its footing. "We will give them a short reprieve, Marshal," Napoleon said, "but only enough to allow us to reorganize. The moment we spot their movements, we will pursue them with all the strength we can muster. The war is at a critical juncture. If we strike now, we can break them for good." Marshal Soult stepped forward, his face unreadable as always, his voice calm and controlled. "Sire, I have sent scouts to observe the enemy's movements. They have been retreating to the northeast, toward the forests. The terrain there will make it difficult for us to catch them quickly. But we can set up a trap. If we surround them from the flanks, they will be forced to either fight or retreat again. We can eliminate their options." Napoleon nodded, his mind already turning over the new information. The forests would provide the enemy with cover, but it could also provide a perfect opportunity for them to make a final stand. If they were cornered, they would fight harder, but that would be their downfall. Napoleon had always thrived when his enemies were forced into desperate situations. It was then that their resolve would falter. "Good," Napoleon said, his voice firm. "We will move at once. I want the army to advance toward the northeast, but carefully. We will close in from both sides, as Soult suggests. We will push them into a corner, and they will have no choice but to face us. There will be no escape." With that, Napoleon turned toward his horse, mounting it with practiced ease. The camp began to stir as the order was passed down. Soldiers began to prepare for the march, securing their gear and taking their places in the lines. The sound of hooves and the rattle of weapons filled the air as the French army began to move forward once again. Napoleon, at the head of the column, rode in silence. His thoughts were distant, his mind focused on the strategy at hand. There was no time for sentiment. There was no time for reflection. The battle was still ongoing, and he would not allow his army to be caught off guard again. The coalition forces had retreated, but they would not escape. As the army moved forward, the fog began to lift, revealing the landscape ahead. The ground was uneven, dotted with patches of forest and marshland. Napoleon's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, calculating every move. The retreating enemy was not far ahead, and he could feel the tension building in the air. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The final push. The sound of marching boots echoed in the still morning air as the French army advanced. Napoleon's officers, close behind, kept their eyes on the surroundings, aware that at any moment, the enemy might spring a surprise. But the men were ready. The soldiers, though tired, carried with them the fierce determination of those who had tasted victory and were not ready to lose it. Napoleon's thoughts turned once more to the men who followed him. They were exhausted, yes, but they were loyal, and that loyalty would carry them forward. He knew they would follow him wherever he led them, even into the unknown. As the French army pressed forward, the first signs of the enemy's position began to appear. A flicker of movement in the trees, the faint sound of distant orders being shouted. The coalition forces were still ahead, still retreating. But they were being pushed closer and closer into the trap. Napoleon's pulse quickened. This was the moment of truth. The coalition could either surrender or face complete destruction. And Napoleon would not allow them to escape. The battle was coming. And once again, Napoleon would lead his army into the fray, determined to bring this war to a close. The final clash was imminent. The forest ahead was dense, its trees towering high, their branches thick and entwined. The damp ground was soft beneath the hooves of the French cavalry as they advanced cautiously, the fog that had hung over the battlefield now dissipating. There was an eerie silence in the air, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the distant call of a bird. Napoleon's gaze was fixed ahead, his eyes scanning the landscape, alert to any signs of movement. The coalition forces were nearby, retreating, but their position in these woods could give them a tactical advantage. Napoleon would not let that happen. His army moved carefully, the sound of marching soldiers muffled by the thick underbrush. The men were exhausted, their faces gaunt from days of relentless marching and fighting, but they knew the stakes. This would be the decisive moment. They had fought too hard to let the enemy slip away now. Napoleon's mind was focused on the unfolding strategy. Marshal Soult's division had already begun to move around the enemy's flank, while Marshal Davout's men were positioned further ahead, preparing to strike from the front. They had encircled the coalition forces, cornering them in the forest, and now, the French army would close in for the final battle. The enemy, already weary from their retreat, would have little chance to escape. The forest was eerily quiet, but Napoleon could sense the tension that had taken hold of the men. The moment of battle was close. He could almost feel the heat of the conflict that would soon erupt from the shadows. His mind worked through the tactics, considering the risks. If the coalition forces had fortified a position here, they would fight fiercely. But Napoleon had no intention of allowing them time to organize a defense. They were already cornered, and he would make sure they stayed that way. He rode at the front of the column, his steely eyes scanning the terrain for any signs of movement. His generals rode beside him, their faces set in grim determination. They had seen this all before, the uncertainty of the final push, the pressure to deliver a decisive victory. Napoleon had led them through countless battles, but this one would be different. This would decide the fate of the war. "Prepare for battle," Napoleon said, his voice cutting through the silence. "We close in from both sides. No mercy. We break them here, once and for all." Marshal Ney, his face stern, nodded in agreement. He knew what was at stake. The men were tired, but they were still ready to fight, to follow Napoleon to the ends of the earth. The coalition forces had been pushed back to this point, and they would not be allowed to escape. Soult's forces were already in position, his scouts having reported sightings of enemy soldiers along the northern edge of the forest. The enemy was trying to secure a defensible position, but Napoleon could feel that they were too disorganized to make a stand. The French army had them on the ropes. As Napoleon gave the order, the sound of movement rippled through the ranks. The men shifted, readying their weapons, tightening their formation. Cavalrymen spurred their horses forward, infantry prepared to march, and artillery began to position itself for the coming barrage. The anticipation hung thick in the air. The forest suddenly came alive with the sound of distant gunfire. A volley of shots rang out, signaling that the enemy had made their first move. A small contingent of coalition soldiers, perhaps unaware of the full extent of the French encirclement, opened fire. But it was a desperate shot, a sign that they were already on the defensive. Napoleon had anticipated this. The battle had begun. "Advance!" Napoleon commanded, his voice carrying over the sound of marching feet and clattering hooves. "Push them into the trap!" The French army surged forward, the cavalry charging ahead, and the infantry following closely behind, moving with deadly precision. The artillery fired in rapid succession, their cannonballs tearing through the trees and exploding into the enemy lines. The sound of thunderous explosions echoed through the forest as the battle erupted into chaos. Napoleon rode at the front, his presence commanding, his eyes constantly scanning the battlefield. He saw the enemy forces beginning to scatter as they realized the full scope of the trap that had been sprung upon them. The French had surrounded them on all sides, and their retreat was no longer possible. The only option left was to fight, and fight they did. The clash of weapons, the roar of cannons, and the cries of soldiers filled the air as the two armies collided. The forest, once calm and silent, was now alive with the violence of war. Men fought hand to hand, their faces contorted with the strain of battle, their bodies covered in mud and blood. The stench of gunpowder and death hung thick in the air, mingling with the cries of the wounded. Napoleon watched the battle unfold with cold precision. His cavalry charged forward, cutting through the disorganized ranks of the coalition soldiers. The infantry pushed in from the sides, their lines steady, their discipline unbroken. The artillery continued to fire, hammering the enemy into submission. The coalition forces, once proud and determined, now found themselves on the edge of collapse. Napoleon's eyes never left the battlefield. He saw the enemy's lines falter, their resistance weakening with every passing moment. His troops were relentless, driven by the certainty of victory, and their confidence only grew as the battle wore on. The coalition forces, realizing their defeat was inevitable, began to crumble. Marshal Ney, leading a charge from the east, was the first to break through the enemy's defenses. His men pushed forward, the sheer force of their advance overwhelming the remaining coalition soldiers. The enemy's morale collapsed as they realized they were trapped, surrounded by French forces on all sides. The retreat that had once seemed possible now evaporated, and their only choice was to surrender or face complete annihilation. Napoleon's eyes flicked over the battlefield once more. The coalition forces were no longer putting up much of a fight. Those who could still stand were attempting to flee, but they were being picked off by the pursuing French soldiers. There would be no escape for them. The final push was coming. Napoleon signaled to his generals, and the French forces began to close in on the remnants of the enemy army. The trap had been sprung, and now it would be sealed. There would be no mercy for those who had dared to oppose the might of the French Empire. As the enemy forces were driven into the forest's heart, Napoleon ordered a final charge. His cavalry surged forward, their sabers drawn, their horses galloping with unrelenting force. The enemy was trapped in the woods, their options exhausted. The sound of hooves grew louder as the French cavalry reached the last of the enemy soldiers. The battle was nearly over. Napoleon, ever the tactician, watched with cold detachment as the final moments of the battle played out. The enemy had been crushed, their forces shattered beyond recovery. They would never again pose a threat to the French Empire. The battlefield was littered with the fallen, the sounds of the fight fading into the eerie silence of the forest once more. The victory was complete. But even as Napoleon looked over the field, his thoughts were already shifting forward. This battle was won, but the war was not yet over. There would be more challenges, more enemies to face. For now, however, The forest stood quiet once again, and Napoleon's victory was absolute. The battlefield was still, but it was not peaceful. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, blood, and crushed earth. The cries of the wounded echoed through the trees, mingling with the quiet sobs of soldiers who had witnessed the brutality of war. The French forces had crushed the coalition, but the toll had been heavy. The forest, once a quiet sanctuary, was now a silent witness to the chaos that had unfolded within its borders. Napoleon rode through the field, his horse stepping carefully over the uneven terrain, its hooves echoing in the stillness. His gaze swept over the landscape, taking in the aftermath of the battle. The forest, which had been the site of such fierce fighting, now looked like a graveyard. The bodies of soldiers from both sides lay scattered among the trees, their once animated forms now nothing more than lifeless reminders of the violence that had consumed them. The ground, once rich with life, had been soaked with blood and littered with the shattered remnants of weapons and equipment. His officers, grim-faced, rode alongside him. Marshal Soult, Marshal Davout, and Marshal Ney were all present, their expressions somber as they took in the aftermath of the fight. The victory had been decisive, but the cost had been high. The men had fought with determination, but the cruelty of the battlefield left little room for celebration. There would be no triumphal cheers here. Napoleon's face remained impassive, his emotions carefully concealed beneath the veneer of a conqueror. He had seen this before, the wreckage of war, the devastation left behind. And yet, the weight of the loss never truly became easier to bear. "Gather the prisoners," Napoleon said, his voice cold and authoritative. "I want them separated, and I want them brought before me. We need to know their numbers, their condition, and their intentions. We will deal with them swiftly." Marshal Soult nodded and rode off to relay the orders. There was little mercy in Napoleon's words, but there was no time to waste. The coalition forces had been crushed, but the war was not yet won. Napoleon knew better than to let complacency set in. Victory here would only be meaningful if it was followed by decisive action. Napoleon dismounted from his horse, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He walked slowly through the carnage, his eyes moving from the fallen soldiers to the surviving troops who were now regrouping. Some were injured, others were weary beyond belief. His soldiers, though tired, looked resolute, their loyalty to their emperor unwavering. But Napoleon knew that their strength had limits. The war had already dragged on far longer than anyone had anticipated, and even the most dedicated men could only endure so much. There would be no rest for them yet. As Napoleon walked among his men, he noticed the hollow eyes of some of the soldiers. Their faces were pale from exhaustion, their bodies covered in grime and blood. They had fought tirelessly, without respite, and now the battlefield lay before them like an unforgiving testament to their struggles. Despite the triumph, there was no joy in their expressions, only the grim satisfaction of having survived. Napoleon was keenly aware of this, and he felt the weight of it on his shoulders. He had promised them glory, but the glory of war often came with a price that few were truly prepared to pay. He had seen it before, the broken men who returned from battle, their minds and bodies shattered by the horrors they had endured. The victory would be remembered, but the human cost of that victory was something that could never be fully measured. A messenger approached, his horse kicking up dust as he rode swiftly toward Napoleon. The man was covered in sweat, his face drawn with urgency. "Your Majesty," the messenger said, dismounting quickly, "the prisoners are ready to be brought before you. There are not many survivors from the enemy ranks. Most were either killed or scattered in the woods." Napoleon nodded grimly. The enemy had been thoroughly defeated, but there were still questions that needed answering. The coalition forces had been pushed to their limits, and their commanders would have to explain how they had been outmaneuvered and broken. Napoleon needed to know what had gone wrong, what mistakes had been made on their side, and how he could exploit those weaknesses in the future. "Very well," Napoleon said, his voice steady but firm. "Bring them to me." Moments later, the prisoners were brought forward. They were a motley group, men in ragged uniforms, their faces gaunt from exhaustion and hunger, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. These were soldiers who had once fought with pride, but now they stood defeated, their spirit broken. Napoleon studied them closely, noting the difference between the hardened veterans and the younger recruits. The officer in charge of the prisoners, a man with a thin beard and a disheveled appearance, stepped forward. His eyes flicked nervously toward Napoleon, but he did not speak. Napoleon waited, his gaze unyielding. "You are the leader of these men?" Napoleon asked, his voice low and commanding. The officer hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, Your Majesty. I was commanding the rear guard. We were outnumbered and outflanked. We could not hold." Napoleon's eyes narrowed. "Outnumbered?" he asked, his tone sharp. "You had more than enough men to make a stand. What happened?" The officer swallowed hard, the weight of his defeat pressing down on him. "The French army, they struck from all sides. We had no chance to regroup. Our communications were lost. Our supply lines were cut. We were scattered in the woods before we could make any effective defense." Napoleon's gaze hardened. This was a failure of leadership as much as it was a failure of strategy. The officer had allowed his men to be caught unprepared, to be divided and overwhelmed. The coalition forces had once again shown their inability to coordinate, to fight as a unified force. Napoleon had capitalized on that weakness, and now it had cost them dearly. "You should have fought harder," Napoleon said quietly. "A retreat is not a defeat unless you allow it to be." The officer bowed his head, his pride shattered. "We tried, Your Majesty. But we could not hold. Our men were demoralized. They had no choice but to surrender." Napoleon regarded the officer for a long moment. There was no glory in surrender. He had seen it all too often, men who would rather die than face the consequences of defeat. But for the enemy, surrender was the only choice left. "You will be treated as prisoners of war," Napoleon said finally. "Your men will be assigned to labor duties. You will write to your leaders, informing them of your failure. This is the price of defeat." The officer nodded meekly, and the prisoners were taken away. Napoleon stood silently for a moment, reflecting on the fate of those who had once been his enemies. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And there would be more prisoners, more survivors who would have to be dealt with in the coming days. The battlefields of Europe were filled with the bodies of those who had fought for power, for land, for glory. But in the end, it was always the survivors who mattered. Turning to his generals, Napoleon's voice was steady as he spoke. "The enemy has been broken, but the war is far from over. We will press on. We will continue our march. And we will bring this war to an end, once and for all." With that, the French army began to move again, the survivors of the battle following in the wake of their emperor. The forests, once full of chaos and violence, now stood silent once again, as the wheels of war continued to turn relentlessly forward.